Chapter 81. Spawns of Void. Spawns of Void. You have absorbed a vestige of the Chaos Prince. The vestige of the Chaos Prince is taking root in your soul. Your soul is being devoured by the void. You do not have a soul core. Soul energy is being consumed by the void. You have awakened a new kind of energy, void essence. You have received a name. You have gained 3 new attributes tied to your name. An extremely rare genetic trait has been discovered in your soul. Void essence has awakened this extremely rare genetic trait. You have gained a new attribute. Northern was not sure what these messages meant, but as they kept popping up and ringing in his head, the pain intensified. His eyes went blank, and the only thing he could see was darkness. Northern hugged himself and shivered as he felt a jarring pain forcefully drive through his muscles. He was not sure what was happening to Night Terror at the moment, but the monster was equally letting out pained growls. At some point, its growls became weak and then stopped altogether. Both of them lay motionless on the floor for a while, then eventually passed out. Northern's eyes slowly came open, though blurry at first. But it wasn't really hard to tell things apart because he was in an inky darkness. However, there was a slight ache at the back of his head. His whole body felt sore. As he stood up, the soreness eased a little. He rested his back against the cave's wall and let out a loud sigh. The sigh seemed to carry a lot more than just tiredness. Northern struggled to remember what had happened, but to no avail. Then, eventually, he did. When he did, he jumped to his feet and tried to trace his way back to the very end of the cave. However, something was different about him. Northern could accurately navigate through the darkness. He could tell each path apart from the moment he stood up. Even the stones and the tiny cracks that ran through the wall were effortlessly picked up by his vision. Even though it was so far away, everything seemed so close in his eyes. And it caused an overwhelming amount of information to enter his eyes, and he couldn't help but feel lightheaded. Then suddenly, without even taking a step forward, he collapsed. My eyes feel numb. Northern raised his hand and tried to massage his eyes. He closed it for a couple of seconds, then opened it again, blinking away the drowsy feeling. Okay, now it's better. Indeed it was. So he stood up. However, he was met by the same amount of information running into his eyes. It was too much and very overwhelming. However, he was adapting to it, so it was becoming bearable. Compared to the first time, Northern was not overwhelmed by headaches, but instead felt at peace. He turned around and saw the minute-crawling insect with 2 antennae and 4 legs. Strangely, even with 4 legs, it was still hopping. And very slowly at that. Northern was not supposed to see an insect of such size. It was so tiny that one would have needed more than the naked eye to see it. To make matters worse, he could see it despite the darkness. Something has happened to me? Northern thought to himself, then returned to his main objective. I guess it's a good thing I can see extra well now. He whispered to himself and began to walk forward. After a couple of seconds, he reached a dead end and paused with a terrified expression wearing thin on his face. What happened here? The mysterious light of the cliff was gone. All the chambers had crumbled to dust. How? Northern's voice trembled. Immediately, a single possibility entered his mind. I'm sure I passed out on the ground in the first chamber. There's only one creature that could have carried me out. Night Terror. Did it rescue him and destroy the temple? Why? Northern thought hard for a while. It was not hard to dig out the reason why Night Terror must have done such a deed. Perhaps even he would have done the same. It's a monster. I can't blame its sense. Still, to destroy the entire place because it did not want any other person to find it out. It was just insane. Northern looked around. He could see the details clearly despite it being so dark. He felt strange, but he liked the new development. Traversing the gloomy forest wouldn't be a problem anymore, and really, being able to see in the dark had solved a good number of his problems. What the hell? Did Night Terror really do this? Northern inquired silently as he investigated the cracks on a wall, the completely broken walls, and the shattered boulders that had all turned to debris. It would take a colossal being to deliver such blows. Northern was sure that whatever happened to him that made his eyes so good in the dark, amongst many other things, had definitely given Night Terror a power of some sort. Northern couldn't help but have a feeling of being robbed. That bastard. He turned and headed towards the entrance of the cave. He had gotten out, and yet Night Terror was nowhere to be found. He sat at the edge of the cave, his legs tempting the deep ground to swallow it. But Northern was not worried about falling down this time around. I feel like I have everything under control. I feel very, very good, Northern commented inwardly, breaking into an absurd smile. He wasn't used to smiling, so now that one came out, it looked odd on his pale, lifeless face. Northern closed and opened his eyes, then looked down, and something shocking happened. He could see as far as into the gloomy forest. And there, Night Terror was currently decimating the scavengers, destroying them with a primal glee burning in its eyes. The stalwart monster tore through the ranks of corpse eaters like he was tearing pieces of paper. It kept melting in and out of darkness, playing with the savage monsters. For some reason, the crimson flames in Night Terror's eyes seemed to burn more ferociously than ever before. Northern's brows creased into a frown. At this point he was sure. That bastard. It has definitely become more powerful. But Night Terror's rise in power was not what amused Northern the most. He was sure that he, too, must have received something. Northern's heart danced with excitement as he summoned the panel of his profile. Let's see what I've got. Chapter 82, Recounting Gains. Profile. Name, Northern Longguard. True name, nameless. Attributes. Formless. Spawn of void. Limitless void. Vestige of chaos. All eyes. Soul rank. Walker. Talent fragments. 978/1000. Copied talents. 1/1. Owned items. Mortal Blade. Eternal Twilight. Silver Sword. Death Glare, and 23 others. You can now check the information of your true name and attributes. It didn't seem like it at first, but after taking a closer look at it, he saw that his profile had really changed. Damn, I have 5 attributes. The maximum number of attributes that drifters were allowed to have by UL standards was only 1. When one received a name, an attribute was automatically tied to it. Of course, the name and attribute often had something to do with their talent. Oftentimes, it was like strings of fate that were woven together to connect a drifter to certain events that had occurred in a past dimension that had fallen to the rift. Northern was about to go through the same thing. He was about to receive a name and gain an attribute. However, an anomaly was discovered. Northern folded his hand, rubbing his chin as he thought to himself. I suppose if the system had not taken full control, UL would have done something to nerf me? However, because of the void essence that corrupted Northern's soul energy, it was made impossible. I don't know if this is a bad thing or a good thing. Northern stared indifferently at his status for a while, particularly looking at the attribute section. Then he scoffed and shrugged, saying, "What can be bad about having 5 attributes? Not just 2, but 5. Something in his heart swelled. Northern could tell the coming days were going to become promising, especially if he considered the fact that he had not even become a drifter, and yet he already had 5 attributes when all drifters had 1. Also, if he took into account the fact that he could now control and manipulate an energy far greater than soul energy, void essence. So much potential to become strong, to become the strongest. Across all dimensions, only I will be the honored one. Northern gleamed maliciously, the light in his blue eyes shining brighter. He had felt bad about having no talent of his own, then even worse for being able to copy just 1 talent as a walker. But suddenly a great compensation had been offered to him. But onto the most interesting part. Northern grinned as he anticipated it. Now that UL's influence upon him had been completely removed by the system, it was possible for him to see the details of his attributes. Northern enthusiastically summoned the letters with his mind. True name, nameless. Description. You are a spawn of void. You are nothing. A vessel of emptiness meant to serve only one purpose. Chaos and destruction. You cannot be named. You are nameless. Northern tilted his head to the left, then to the right. Something is odd, abusive, and strangely amusing about this description, he thought to himself. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the description called him nothing. Is that because of the nature of the void? A vessel of emptiness. The most amusing thing he noticed was that, I cannot be named. Northern lips curled up. Something about this makes me feel like I'm special. It would have been a different case if it said, you don't deserve a name. You should just be nameless. But that part of the description which said, you cannot be named. You are nameless had a powerful ring to it. It sounded like Northern was a vessel that could not be affected by the naming concept. Northern shook his head as his thoughts went deeper. Let's just continue checking this for now. True name, nameless. Description. You are a spawn of void. You are nothing, a vessel of emptiness meant to serve only one purpose, chaos and destruction. You cannot be named. You are nameless. Your name is a vast sea of bleakness that swallows others and causes nothing but despair. Unique ability, UN name. UN name. You can absorb the name of others and make them nameless. When names are absorbed, attributes are absorbed with them and broken into fragments. Attribute fragments can be used to enhance your own attributes. The stronger the rank of the name, the more fragments will be received. Northern's mouth fell open. Woo 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 woo. He almost fell down the mountain in his excitement, but it wasn't hard to regain his balance. Maybe it was because of the void essence that now filled his soul, but he had a more definite control of his body than when he was using soul energy. Or it could be something else. Northern reconsidered. Being able to unname a named person was huge. This literally made him an anomaly. Wait, was this the reason Ul said an anomaly had been detected? Meaning that if Ul had been allowed full control, she would have surely done something to nerf him. Northern exhaled and smiled heartily. Again, he looked so ridiculous. Then he said, looking down at the panel, man, I sure am grateful that the copycat system stepped in. After a pause, he added, I think I might just die from excitement. I haven't even checked my attributes yet. But wait, is it really normal to have abilities tied to one's name? Northern wondered aloud. However, there was no answer to such a question until he met another human. And maybe asked them? Or maybe not. He wasn't confident in his socializing skills, so he would just put off that thought for now. However, his name gave him an overpowering potential already. Being able to break others' attributes down into fragments and use them to enhance his own sounded very promising. I suppose that was just the doing of the copycat system. Attribute fragments, talent fragments, they all sound the same. Northern exhaled. He lingered for a while before resuming reading through the description. True name, nameless. Description. You are a spawn of void, you are nothing, a vessel of emptiness meant to serve only one purpose, chaos and destruction. You cannot be named. You are nameless. Your name is a vast sea of emptiness that swallows others and causes nothing but despair. Unique ability. UN name. Attributes. Name. Formless. Rank. Fated. Description. A demon of development, flexibility, and adaptability. These attributes enable you to easily adapt to anything. Natural phenomenon, state of being, state of mind, state of physicality. You can become anything while applying a major level of flexibility to yourself. Your formlessness absorbs others' form into its own. Wow! Northern nodded in approval. Moving on to the next. Name. Spawn of void. Rank. Mystic. Description. You are a spawn of void. Because of this, you can detect and manipulate void essence to an immense degree. Name. Limitless void. Rank. Mystic. Description. Limitless void is a metaphysical world that exists in your soul. Northern looked at the description for a while as his brows rose. I have a world in my soul? It sounded so confusing, but he just couldn't wait to see that world. However, he wanted to see everything first, most especially the last one. He suspected that All Eyes could be the reason for his excellent eyesight, so he couldn't wait to see its description. Then he moved on to the next. Chapter 83. All Eyes. Name: Vestige of Chaos. Rank: unknown. Description: unknown. Northern looked at the panel, itching the back of his head in confusion. There just has to always be a mysterious one, huh? He sighed and moved on. After all, nothing could be done about an unknown attribute. Name: All Eyes. Rank: divine. Description: this is an extremely rare genetic trait that appears once in every 10 generations. As of now, not much is known about your esoteric blue eyes. Effects: eternal gaze, perfect body. Eternal gaze. All Eyes grants its user extraordinary visual prowess. Their perception is heightened. They can perceive the world in unparalleled detail, allowing them to see beyond the limits of an ordinary vision. Their eyes take on a distinct appearance, glowing with a mesmerizing blue ambience that signifies the activation of their power. Perfect body. All Eyes requires a certain kind of body called perfect body which you possess. This makes you an even rarer gem than your ancestors because not all possessors of this visual prowess are blessed with a perfect body. However, because of your well-suited body for this visual prowess, you have an innate understanding of your body. Northern didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or just jump around shouting. It was overwhelming. A lineage ability. Damn right. I figured I had to be special with all that drama after my birth. Thanks to Void Essence, the innate ability of his eyes had been pushed out. Northern smirked. I feel so good. I just might fall down this mountain. It was now understandable why the ferocious monster was down there obliterating corpse eaters for fun. It must have gotten exponentially stronger since it swallowed one of the orbs. To think I'd still have to kill that bastard. Chills ran through his spine at the thought of his fight with Night Terror, the time they would finally end their accursed fate of being together. It was inevitable, and Northern did not know exactly how it would happen, but he most likely knew when. After all, Night Terror needed him to defeat the incredible Rift Guardian, the castle lord whom Northern suspected could be a Maelstrom rank. Let him be of a low danger level at the very least, Northern begged inwardly. He stared down into the gloomy forest for a while, observing with an impossible level of detail how Night Terror cleaved through the horde of corpse eaters. Its sleek movements are fast and minimal. The throw of its claws. Northern simply began watching since he had nothing to do. However, he began to understand the creature the more he looked at the scene. Perhaps this was due to All Eyes or his formless attributes. Northern couldn't tell which in particular, but now, being able to pay attention to Night Terror's form of battle, Northern began to slowly understand the reason why he was formless. And he suspected that a large percentage of it had to do with the kind of body he had due to All Eyes. The only question he had was how he had received it. He couldn't stop asking himself if it really was a coincidence or if All had given what was meant to be his as a candy to reward him for his hard work. Either way, Northern paid attention. Minutes bled into hours, and he was so engrossed with watching Night Terror that he didn't know so much time had passed. Then again, it wasn't like he would have noticed either way. Every second, minute, hour, and day looked exactly the same in this hellish realm. When Night Terror eventually started sprinting through the forest, Northern averted his gaze and stood up. He had seen all that he needed to see. A small smile spread along his lips. One could tell he had made some kind of discovery. He just wouldn't say anything about it. Not to his nemesis. Especially one he dreaded the most but at the same time considered the most valuable in this rift. Northern stood at the entry of the cave and leaned against the wall, while he waited for his associate to come back. The mountain seemed to tremble as Night Terror approached. The monster did not even take as long as it did the first time they came. With legs digging cracks into the stone, it leapt powerfully and landed on the mountain. Its claws carved deeply into the rocky stone as it grabbed the wall of the mountain and swung itself higher with just one hand. Then landed mightily right in front of Northern, who scoffed and muttered, "Show off." Night Terror looked at Northern, its eyes gleaming with a new kind of ferocity. Its thrill was so palpable it felt tangible. A pearl of sweat formed on Northern's face as he took a closer look at the beast. With these eyes, he seemed to be able to accurately perceive Night Terror's power, and could tell with a surety, "You have advanced in danger level, haven't you?" He raised his eyes to the stalwart critter. Night Terror stared at him for a couple of seconds, its eyes blazing with primal ferocity. It was like its original nature had returned, but stronger. Northern couldn't help but feel intimidated for a while. His skin tingled with fear, albeit just for a second. Night Terror averted its gaze and stared towards the brown lushes, where they had come from. It didn't need to say anything. Northern had gotten the message loud and clear. It was obvious with all the glee that was burning in the monster's 4 eyes. It was ready. They were ready. However, Northern still felt like he needed more time to practice with Night Terror and also practice what could be a deadly battle style for him, adapted from Night Terror's form of movement. Time was their best ally, but these two were suddenly becoming impatient now. Northern was a bit skeptical, of course. Left to him, he would have stayed back and trained more. But it wasn't like he could reason with a monster. Finally, this brings me a step closer to leaving this hell. He looked at Night Terror, a weird notion seeping into his mind. Immediately, he slapped both his cheeks. "Wake up, Northern. Seriously, miss this bastard." After spending so much time with the Terror without the annoying need to socialize, it was a little bit understanding why Northern would start getting attached to a monster and reconsidering his decision to kill it. But they had to do what they needed to do. And what they needed to do was put an end to the Maelstrom-ranked Castle Lord. What Northern, however, needed to do alone was put an end to this hell. Close the rift once and for all. Chapter 84, Unmatched. The journey down the mountain wasn't so hard, even for Northern. He leaped into the air and dove down, feeling the air whip against his skin as he forcefully plunged downwards. Almost at ground level, he summoned the mortal blade and stabbed it into the rocky side of the mountain with frightening force. Then he instantly killed his speed with his legs, landing against the side of the mountain with a lot of power in his legs. And all that power caused an impact on the mountainside, creating a loud shockwave. It didn't even take him a minute to come up with something almost impossible to do. Was this what it meant when it said, "I have an innate understanding of my body"? Northern wondered. He dislodged the mortal blade, sending it back into his soul, and then he slid down the mountain slope and landed at its base. The rest was a simple walk downwards. Night Terror had landed on the ground with just a single jump and was already closer to the gloomy forest than Northern was. After a couple of minutes of walking, Northern entered the forest. This time he didn't need to be as cautious as he was the last time because of his inability to see. Even though it was very dark, Northern walked through indifferently. The light orb materialized beside him, its brightness becoming absorbed by the darkness. And for once, Northern's torchlight was utterly useless. Not that I expected it to do anything, it was just supposed to be a test. He could see the position of the corpse eaters, could see the crawling insects on the ground, and even the state of the soil if he wanted to. No little detail could escape his eyes. I don't know if I'm ever going to get used to this. It's just so amazing. Once again Northern allowed a grin that made him look perverse. Oh well then, should I have some action too? Northern summoned the silver sword and twirled it before dashing into the darkness. With a profound understanding of his entire body, Northern was fast. He was like a flash of light in the darkness, his sword easily cutting through the flesh of the monsters like it was cutting through tofu. He slashed his sword in arcs as he slipped between them, dodged their onslaught effortlessly, and stabbed them with the sword. His eyes played a much larger role than he thought it would, and it only excited him more. His pupils shot across then, with a profound movement of his body, Northern darted into the sphere of attack, like lightning dashing amongst the monsters. The silver sword was like flashes of light dancing in the dark as he sliced the monsters with slick fluidity. Despite Night Terror having decimated almost all the monsters, Northern was still faced with an overwhelming amount of corpse eaters. But they were so easy to kill. Before, He had struggled because he hadn't been able to see through the darkness. Now he stabbed and sliced them apart as they jumped onto him, his sword swinging in the darkness with frightening accuracy. Sometimes, he didn't even look at what he was tearing apart with his sword. As a group of corpse eaters lunged at him from the front, Northern wrenched his sword from the body of his most recent kill. Resetting his grip on the hilt for a throw, he swung his arms powerfully forward, propelling the sword through the air. The silver sword impaled the first monster, then hurled it backward as though it had no weight, and also stabbed through a second one before wedging both bodies into the tree. Yes, he didn't actually think it would work, but it did. 2 monsters, huh? I guess that's as far as my full power can go for now. With 700+ talent fragments, he felt incredibly strong, but in reality he was just... Northern shook his head vigorously to get rid of the thought. No, 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 don't do that, North, he stopped himself. Then his eyes blazed with flames of determination, slightly illuminating the part of the darkness where he stood. We've come so far already. Let's appreciate ourselves for a job well done. But no slacking. I will close down this rift and become the strongest. He summoned the mortal blade again, dismissing the silver sword in the process. Then weaved through the monster-filled forest with the onyx sword merging with the darkness as it flashed across. After a couple of minutes, Northern and Night Terror were standing outside the gloomy forest. I guess that took shorter than the last time, he whispered looking back. His brows furrowed, lines of frustration straining against his forehead. Then he added in a low tone, "Those bastards kept running away." Corpse eaters were by far the lamest of monsters Northern had come across in the rift. They were monsters that only ate dead things. However, their hunger and numbers had given them the audacity to go for more, to challenge a living thing. But now, the Walker and Hellion had instilled in them so much fear that they would never approach anything that breathed, even if it was harmless. Northern and Night Terror were now more formidable than they had ever been, thanks to the vestige of the Chaos Prince. Night Terror was about to start moving when Northern immediately stopped him. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, quickly grabbing the monster's left hand. Northern quickly released the hand due to the itchy feel of its furs. More so, Night Terror looked like he was about to bite his head off, allowing a very fierce low snarl the moment he touched the monster. Ahem. Northern looked away. I mean, you are not thinking of going through the same route we used to escape, are you? The monster looked confused but stared at him nonetheless. Northern, after a few seconds of silence, sighed and explained. See, that was where we escaped through. So they would have definitely sealed that place off the moment they found out we escaped. Even if it is unsealed, it will be because they expect you to come back through that same route. A trap may be lying in wait for you, you know? Or am I giving them too much credit? Even he wasn't sure. He could be overthinking it. Either way, it was better to be safe than sorry. Night Terror, at this point, was paying attention to him. Perhaps the monster found what he was saying to be reasonable. Northern was happy with the Terror's response, so he continued. So, instead of doing what they expect, how about doing what they never expected? His eyes flickered mischievously. Chapter 85, Northern's Plan. The front gate. The Terror tilted its head, its grotesque face etched with a puzzled frown. So Northern replied with an acceptable explanation. It might seem like a stupid plan, but think about it like this. Whether it was the front or back gate, we would still end up killing almost all the monsters in the castle anyway, wouldn't we? Night Terror was paying full attention. So, why not just go through the front where they never expected that we would try to attack them from? Who knows, they might even have stationed more troops at the back than the front just because they expect us to attack from that end. Night Terror looked to be lost in his thoughts, if monsters actually did think. Although this plan of Northern's was quite accurate and sensible, there was a fatal flaw which he also suspected might be the case. The monsters might not be expecting them at all. Northern suspected that they would have moved on with their lives and continued going to war, as another battle general would have risen and was maybe on the verge of also being made into a breeding machine, if they had not stayed away for too long, that is. But he was still going to go ahead with it because it was the least he could do to make things work in his favor. This plan of his served only one purpose: to make Night Terror the bus he would ride on. Northern's plan was simple: make Night Terror attack through the front gate. It didn't matter if they were waiting or not. The monster would plunge through their defense and into the castle since it was now stronger than ever. It definitely would not care about their numbers. Northern's plan was to use that time to sneak in from behind. No matter how much he wanted to get all the talent fragments, evolve, and unlock a new slot for his talent copying ability. In fact, merely thinking about it had him all riled up. But he had to exercise patience and take into account the fact that he had never in his life evolved. He didn't know what it would mean, how it would work. Therefore, doing so in the middle of a battle seemed thoughtless to him. Besides, what changes would it make? Sure, he would be stronger and faster. He would be a drifter and also be able to accurately control his energy void essence. But he would still be unable to copy talents. It wasn't like he could do so with monsters. And even if he could, he doubted whether he would want a monster's talent. He still had to wait till he closed down the rift and returned to the academy, where he was bound to meet thousands of amazing talents. So, instead of depending on his state after reaching 1,000 fragments to pull this mission through, both defeating the Castle Lord and his inevitable battle with Night Terror, he could just lower the odds by being sneaky and wearing down Night Terror, while preserving the majority of his own strength and unleashing it at the last moment in the last fight. However, since it was easier said than done, Northern did not expect a perfect execution of this plan, as the monster itself had proven to be quite smart. But should it fail, Northern would have no choice but to depend on his evolution and what came after it. However, he really didn't want to go down that route, having convinced Night Terror that going through the main gate of the castle was better. They changed the course of their destination. Instead of going through the brown lush and the tunnel, they would have to go around it. Step 1 is done. Step 2 is to make it trust me even more. Now, let's hope that works out. Northern thought to himself as both of them strode away. Meanwhile, outside the rift, footsteps resounded in the hollow hall as two individuals walked along. One came off strong and powerful while the other was soft and almost staggering. Soon, they arrived before a door, pushed it open and entered. The individual with the soft footsteps slumped into the tattered couch of the room. Her overflowing vermilion hair gently brushed against her face with each sway of the wind. She had a blank expression on her face, and her usually vibrant but now dull eyes slowly slid to her dominant hand, which usually held a bottle. Unfortunately, this time there was no bottle in it, and neither was there any in her armpit. She let out an exasperated sigh and leaned her head on the couch, staring up at the ceiling that had been covered with cobwebs. Since they were in an apocalyptic environment, a lot of things were quite hard for them to get. Most especially alcohol. Food was obtained by hunting the monsters that wandered around. Teams of drifters were formed and each team was tasked with hunting food for the people. Of course, they also had to eat moderately so the drifters wouldn't have to hunt every day. This little arrangement had been put together by Gilbert after they all arrived here 6 months ago, and it had brought about considerable development to the place. Half of the Lotheloan nation had been taken from the monsters. The other half, however, was still teeming with extremely strong monsters that none of the students could handle at their level. Gilbert and his Citadel cohort could have handled it and tried to vanquish the monsters there, but he decided against it. This was to control the people by instilling fear in them, having done so much for them after their arrival. The native people of Starlock Continent, to be particular, Lotheloanians, began to depend on them more since they were the most affected by this incident. Leaving those monsters, there was Gilbert's idea to not make the people think that they were free. Regardless, he had completely handled the aftermath of the fiasco such that the people were better now than they had been in 30 years. Of course, events had come and gone, many of which Gilbert could not have done much against. Overall, everything was manageable and Gilbert needed it to stay that way. Walking towards the wooden office table, Gilbert unhooked his scabbard from his waist and placed it on the table. Then he turned and leaned against it, looking at Annette indifferently as he asked, "So, what about him?" The warm and elderly innocence in his eyes from months ago had completely disappeared. Now he only radiated a cold demeanor. Annette sighed again, then straightened her head, propping herself to sit up before speaking. It's the same. There were no signs of him. I don't know why you won't give up on searching for the boy. It's either he didn't come with us or he's dead. What are the chances that Grandmaster Ruffsburg did not deceive you? Annette's voice was cold and void of its usual energy. Gilbert folded his hand in front of his chest, spending a dozen seconds in silence before giving Annette his answer. Keep looking. There is a chance that the Slorians might have picked him up. We can't be sure of anything. One thing I know, though, is that Ruffsburg couldn't have tricked me. Annette frowned, inwardly gritting her teeth. She stood up and lowered her head, hiding the grim expression on her face as her throaty voice came out. You know, I used to respect you so much. But ever since your meeting with Grandmaster Ruffsburg, I can't even tell who you are anymore, a dog or the Citadel headmaster I once knew. She left the office without sparing him a backward glance. Gilbert, folding his arms, gripped his sleeves tightly for a couple of seconds before he let them go and exhaled heavily. With a sad expression dawning on his face, he breathed.
I'm sorry, Anne.
I am nothing but a dog desperately trying to be free from that man's reins. Then he sat on the floor and let a heavier sigh. Chapter 86. A Rift Inside a Rift? Night Terror and Northern began their journey to the kingdom of Red Mine. For most part, they just walked silently beside each other, not taking any rest. Northern at intervals took in the meretricious view of the landscape. With no source of light to cast a warm ambience on it, everything vapid, like the land itself had fallen from grace. Northern, as he strode along, began to think about where the rift's core might be located. Since this seems to be a rift that was mainly affected by the kingdom of Red Mine, he suspected that the core would have something to do with the story of the monarch that sacrificed his entire kingdom for power, to become stronger. Other than that, he was pretty null. He didn't know what else to think. In fact, he didn't know how these things worked. This was his first time in a rift after all. Silently, Northern walked beside Night Terror. Time slowly blurred past as both horrors rounded the brown lush. The scenery began to recede. Less of the brown lush could be seen, and as they continued their walk, their sights were completely ridden of it. Now it was just a barren land with a gloomy air. Corpses of monsters were scattered across here and there and were almost melting with the ground. The effect of war, Northern mused. The land had taken a severe damage from the persistent slaughters of monsters. Dark and crimson blood smeared the lands and prevented the outgrowth of life. And as time played its effect on the wide expanse, it became gruesome, bending to the cataclysmic effect of the madness that ruined every being in this realm. The land itself seemed inflicted by it. Northern sneezed as he looked away. In front of them, an endless expanse of barren, rocky land met the dark sky. It was almost like they were walking into the terrifying maw of darkness. They continued down this path for a while, walking with grave silence. At intervals, Northern would look up or sideways. Other times he just strode forward, his eyes shimmering with flickers of purpose. Of course, those were times when he thought of how hard it was going to be and strengthened his resolve to pull through. Other times he just wondered if they really were going in the right direction. Tiredness pulled his legs, making them slower by the second. But Northern could tell that they were in the right track, because the Red Mountain still lingered behind them, getting farther away from them with every step, but still wasn't disappearing from their hindsight. As their journey stretched continuously, something strange began to happen. Northern turned his head around, observing the air. It was different than usual. The air was hot and windy, just in a particular area up ahead. From vantage point, it seemed as though it was a slight tornado. Perhaps he would have been deceived if he had not awakened the visual prowess of all eyes. Northern didn't even need to squint his eyes before seeing it. Ahead of them, something was subtly shimmering within the cyclone of wind, and that thing seemed to crackle with power. Northern frowned slightly, guessing what it might be. He picked up his tired steps and dashed forward. Scuttling his way to the heavy wind, Northern came to an abrupt pause, staring at what stayed caged in the wind with a paled face. "It's a gate! It's a rift!" Northern exclaimed. The blue aura that was being emanated from within, the vertical crack in space, and the foreboding heaviness that shrouded the surrounding. Everything linked to only one answer. A rift. But how? How is a rift inside a rift? Or this isn't a rift. Northern knew nothing about the Dark Continent and what had happened to it. He had no idea of where Ruffsburg had sent them to. As a result, it led him to naturally think that it was a rift. Perhaps Ruffsburg had sent each of them into a rift. Why though? To test them? For them to prove their worthiness to enter into the academy? Whatever reason it was, Northern experienced so much hell because that man's decision. And although he didn't want to fuel himself with hatred, it didn't mean he felt no anger towards the deranged kid. Or elder, whatever he is. Now, seeing a rift inside what he thought was a rift, all this while made him so confused. No, this is definitely a rift. That one thing Northern was sure about. What else would be the explanation of the recent happenings? The kingdom of Red Mine. The hidden temple in the mountain. They were like relics of the civilization that once lived in this dimension. So definitely this is a rift. Was this the way outside the rift? No, that can't be. A rift closes up immediately a walker enters. Except it has shattered, and if it has shattered, the monsters inside would be fewer than they are right now. To be exact, the moment a rift appears and drifters enter, it closes up. Of course, a required number of drifters has to enter before its gateway disappears. There were also some pros and cons to this thing which Northern didn't really know about. For example, when a rift appears, its gateway doesn't immediately disappear even if drifters enter. However, once the rift occurrence passes 72 hours, the gateway disappears should anyone enter. That is why scouting drifters are made to patrol the place and find out necessary information within 72 hours. The little Northern knew, once again, were tales told to him from his parent. He lacked a lot in knowledge about rifts and being a drifter, which was what made this situation very perplexing for him. Night Terror loomed behind him, standing with a powerful glare in its eyes. Northern could tell that the monster was probably waiting for his decision. Maybe it recognized what this was, maybe it didn't. So many uncertainties surrounding it. Even though he wished to enter and see for himself what it was, he couldn't. He had something to settle. He sighed and straightened his expression. Then he said to himself in a low whisper, "It's annoying, but I can't go. I have to close down this rift. I doubt this is a gateway, but even if it is, where is the glory in running away from this one?" He turned and looked at Night Terror. "And it's not like this bastard is just going to let me go through it." That's right, if he wanted to go through the rift, he had to be prepared to go past Night Terror. At its peak condition. With a sigh, Northern turned and they continued to their destination. Chapter 87. This can only go my way. After passing the rift, the journey was not far anymore. They strode along a winding path and reached a point that Northern knew all too well. Northern at first squinted his eyes suspiciously. Although the place occurred to him as familiar, he couldn't pick in his memory which point he had arrived here. Maybe it was just one of the times from when I was lost in my subconscious. Northern turned his head around. Even though he had given himself a reasonable explanation, it was still puzzling. He almost felt as if he was being lazy in his mind. So he tried to think deeper. This point, they had traversed from stony earth to black soil. The air around this area was pungent and disgusting, and almost suffocated Northern. The Terror, on the other hand, does not look to be affected by things such as smell. All the times Northern have been assaulted by bad odors, it stood unaffected. Northern felt jealous a bit. Of all things he could condone. But bad smell. Damn those kids with body odors in the town. He would go as far as distancing himself with anyone that stank, bad breath or body odor, whatever kind of bad smell it was. He paused and looked leftwards as they walked the moisty black soil that threatened to sink their legs. Seeing a cavern entrance, a few memories effortlessly flooded into his mind. Of course! A wistful smile appeared on his face as the sight rang a bell in his mind. Mr. Fluffy! He paused and stared into the darkness of the cave for a while. Then his eyes shot wide. Northern dashed forward immediately, not caring that the Terror might mistake his action. Night Terror, however, cocked its head left and right before following Northern, and it did not run. Northern made his way through the inky darkness of the cave without any discrepancies, then stopped. Small twigs were gathered together, their edges burnt off, and ashes underlaid beneath. Northern narrowed his eyes. It's fresh, just like the time he came here. There's someone living in the cave? Of course, Northern had earlier thought it to be one of the students, perhaps someone that got teleported into the rift alongside him. However, it was impossible for the person to survive that long, except they stayed in the cave throughout. It was not like staying in the cave would guarantee their safety too. If they didn't walk into danger, danger would walk into them. For anyone to survive at all in a rift, particularly this hellish realm, they had to know the ropes so much. When I arrived before, the fire was burning now. It seemed to have been freshly put out. Northern crouched, observing the ashes with a keen look. He didn't need to touch it to tell that it was warm. He could see the subtle waves of smoke that flowed out, which by the way should be invisible at this level. Northern stood up and slowly rolled his eyes across the cave. No signs of life, none at all. He heaved a sigh and turned, saying to Night Terror as he passed it, "Let's go." The stalwart monster, who had been silently looking from behind with a hint of puzzlement, turned around and silently followed Northern, barely making a sound even with its feet. Tugged with so many confusing questions, Northern tried to keep a clear head as he neared his second goal. After a couple minutes of work, they reached another setting. The land had changed from what Northern last saw it to be, becoming dry and a prelude into barrenness. But the three large rocks that made it distinct were still there unchanged. With those, Northern was sure he was in the right place. This was another reason why he chose this route. Of course, Northern did not just decide based on assumptions. It wasn't like he knew his way around the rift. After receiving all eyes, he took himself to sit at the edge of the mountain, where he observed Night Terror. However, Night Terror was not the only thing he observed. By pure coincidence, his eyes fell on the three rocks that marked the area where he kept his treasured possession, and that was when he remembered the pile of soul cores he had buried somewhere. He couldn't even remember which rock he had buried it beside, but he was sure it was beside a rock. So he began to dig. The mortal blade became a shovel he used to upheave sand which was already hardening. After digging deep enough, Northern, with the back of his hands, particularly his hand wraps, wiped away the beads of sweat that formed on his forehead. Then he dragged himself towards the next one, which was the smallest, situated in between. Night Terror, wordlessly sorry, growlessly observed the human as it began digging with what should be a weapon of war, a mantle of authority that the lord of the castle had itself bestowed upon him. An expression of amusement contorted morbidly on the monster's face. The monster almost flared as Northern shouted, "Yes!" Licking his upper lips like a dubious maniac. He began to remove all the soul cores, and there were quite a number of them. Northern, when he was done, stood up, turned and pointed to the cores, his eyes glimmering with pride. "Here, I've seen you eat soul cores. You can eat these too and become stronger for the purpose of what lies before us," Northern stated confidently to the monster. His act of silence was met by a grave silence. Night Terror had a deadpan expression, first unresponsive. Then it slowly shifted its four eyes to look at the piles of soul cores on the ground, brought them back to Northern and narrowed them. Two was probably as cautious as the human, and Northern could see that. With both of his palm extended into the air, Northern gestured. Calm down, I'm not being thoughtless. I will get automatically stronger as I fight, but you, I presume, have to eat these. So it's a fair trade, isn't it?" The monster, after staring at Northern for a dozen seconds, finally trudged forward and picked one core. The monster crushed the core within its hand, then poured it into its mouth, moving on to the next one. Behind the terror, Northern sneaked out a menacing grin. Now that the second part of his plan is done, Night Terror, at least until their battle, is bound to trust Northern enough not to look back. Monsters were simple-minded after all, no matter how intelligent they seemed. I can do this. He had spent so much dreadful time in this hell, and finally, he will end it himself. There is only one way this can go. Northern looked at Night Terror, his blue eyes glowing, subtly radiating an ambience of cold brutality. He muttered, "This is only allowed to go my way. I will end this hell today." Chapter 88. The last war is starting. After a strenuous walk for both of them, they finally came face to face with the colossal plate of rusting metal that separated them from what was to be of their fate. Or their fate of what was to be of them. Either one of what it was made chills run down Northern's spine. His palms were clammy and he could feel spit dry up from his throat. Terror threatened to grip his heart, but Northern responded with a soothing exhalation, closing his eyes as he let out air through his mouth. He inhaled and exhaled a few times, eventually steadying his breath. He opened his eyes and they shimmered with an ethereal azure hue. Northern turned to look at how his associate for the moment was currently handling things. However, his face paled. What the hell? Night Terror had a grin parting its lipless mouth, smearing its already hideous face with a mask of buzzard madness. At that moment, Northern could only think, how far has the madness affected? At first, he was unsure if Night Terror really was affected by the madness. It acted normal, communicated normal, despite it not being verbally. Northern lived with for a few nights. He didn't feel that would have been possible if Night Terror had been inflicted by the same madness all this while. But looking at the stalwart monster right now, he couldn't help but sense it to be a flawless manifestation of madness itself. Northern sighed and looked forward. Well, it all works in my favor. The madder he is, the more he fights, and the smoother I can just walk in his shadow and pop out when it's time to kill him. Trailing away from his thoughts, Northern raised his gaze. After a few seconds of lingering, he said in a low tone, "So, how exactly do we get this to open up?" That had been a part of his plan he didn't even think about at all. Night Terror, on the other, seemed to had already taken that into account. The monster grinned even wider and looked at Northern for a few seconds, causing the human to raise a brow and grunt. What? But Night Terror offered no words, not that he could. Even in his expressions, as oftentimes he would, this time, he just stared indifferently. Northern could tell it was up to something. Perhaps it was because both of them had spent a good amount of time together. He was getting to understand the terror more and more. Scary. This bastard is definitely up to something. Night Terror's eyes glinted with a strange menacing spark. After averting its gaze away from Northern, the evil creature strode away to the left, following the wall till it disappeared. Northern stared with a puzzled expression till it was out of sight. Then he turned back to the gate of the castle. Just what is that bastard up to now? A few moments later, thud, thud, thud. Northern's eyes widened as he saw a massive critter stride forward slowly but powerfully. Each step shook the earth. But it was not the fear of the critter that gripped his heart. It was the immense disappointment he felt in himself. Surely, after learning to read in a very early age, surpassing other kids, Northern has been led to believe he was an unparalleled genius. It was a flaw in his own thinking. He was wise in his own eyes when he had only been constricted to a limited number of people with low exposure to what should determine brilliancy and intelligence. He was misled to believe he was an unparalleled genius, misled. However, the situation of his reality now down on him. He even saw himself to be an even greater fool now than ever before. How come I never thought of this? He had definitely seen this monster once, and he had seen them open the gate for it. Even if the monster seemed big enough to aid them in leaping over the wall. But he never thought of that. Hell, he never even thought of how they would cross the gate. Northern frowned. Disappointment could be seen tensely straining his facial feature. He had been busy with other thoughts. Thousands of questions had been bugging him. This thing's happens a few times, he didn't need to be too hard on himself.
No.
Northern's eyes glimmered with a cerulean fierceness. That is just excuses. I'm only making excuses, he said to himself, albeit internally. He couldn't afford to go easy on himself, not anymore. This was a suffering worth stressing over, but he felt he was beginning to get complacent. This was not how he envisioned things going. Had his intellectual fortitude been affected because of the difficulty of these past few shifts of his life? Was he slowly receding mentally because of hardship? Northern, as a reincarnator, when he heard of the opportunities this life brought, was excited. They were dangerous, but he couldn't deny the excitement that came with the thought of achieving so much. They were things he wanted to try, places he wanted to go, and mostly he wanted to become strong. So strong that no man in this world would despise him. Even if they did, they'd have not the guts to look him in the eye. He wanted to become fate, destiny. That just happens to everyone, and there's nothing no one can do about it. However, he had forgotten all that. He had driven away from all that, and was beginning to act below expectation without him realizing. He was beginning to get complacent with things. Why? Because it was difficult in this place. Northern suddenly felt disgust gathered at the tip of his throat. He spat out saliva and looked away in disdain towards himself. As the stalwart monster reached the front of the gate, slowly, the massive metal began to creak open. It was starting. The last war was starting. Chapter 89. A Living Nightmare. 6 legs sluggishly crept into the tension that sifted through the air as the gate swung open. Inside wafted with eerie silence. It could be seen that the monsters were currently being extremely cautious. The colossal monster strutted in slowly, as if to intentionally add to the tension that was already pressing the atmosphere. Nothing could be seen attached to the beast of burden. Usually, it would have links of chains connected to it and clink with each movement, but this time around, it moved alone. Each monster had their claws out, poised for a strike. They all bent in a way that showed they suspected that something was wrong and were ready to lunge themselves. The shelled critter fully entered the walls of the castle and stopped. 2 bipedal monsters moved to close the gate, however, before they could as much make a noise. Their throat was slit and body hidden away. The gate was not closing. The monsters were now gnarling, staring at the gate, perhaps thinking something was definitely wrong, even though they were nothing but shells of horror possessed by an immense madness. The air became cold as a deafening silence settled in the area. Everything and everyone settled in the embrace of an absolute calm before the storm for a few seconds. Then, night terror happened. In the blink of an eye, the stalwart monster became a blur of motion, a whirlwind of chaos and carnage. Its razor-sharp claws sliced through flesh and bone with ease, cleaving limbs and rending bodies asunder. Now, even faster than it ever was. The monsters, caught off guard by the ferocity of the onslaught, could only muster feeble attempts at defense before succumbing to the relentless onslaught. Crimson arcs of viscera painted the air, accompanied by the sickening sounds of tearing flesh and splintering bone. Night terror moved with a demonic grace, its form shifting and undulating like a living nightmare, evading strikes and countering with devastating force. As the initial wave of monsters fell, their brethren mustered their courage and rushed forward, claws and fangs bared. But night terror was a force of nature, an unstoppable juggernaut that left only a trail of mutilated corpses in its wake. Northern, a mere speck in the chaos, watched in awe and trepidation as the night terror unleashed its fury upon the horde. With each strike, the creature seemed to grow in speed and power, its darkness consuming all in its path, like a void. At the point of that realization, darkness clung to the terror like a cloak, swimming with its form as it shot in and out of bodies, leaving them in a wake of gruesome blood splatters. Carnage and chaos malevolently rolled through the air. Undoubtedly, Northern felt like he was getting to have a first-hand experience by sight as to what it meant to be a spawn of the Chaos Prince. Night terror had grown vastly from what it used to be. It had become tremendously powerful and didn't even seem to be sweating each kill it made. It did enjoy the act of slaughter before, but now the monster seemed not to just be enjoying the act but also the art. The castle compound was wide enough to contain over 1,000 people and still have more space. Monsters were scattered here and there. Some were currently making their way from the yard. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of spilled blood and ruptured viscera, the unholy symphony of battle echoing over the walls of the castle. It didn't matter the development or increasing numbers. Night terror showed no signs of relenting, its insatiable hunger for destruction driving it ever forward. It lashed out like whipped tendrils, snaring unwary monsters and flinging them against the unyielding stone walls with bone-shattering force. Limbs and viscera exploded in grotesque bursts, painting the surroundings in a macabre tapestry of crimson and gore. The horde pressed forward, undeterred by the mounting losses, their numbers seemingly endless. Grotesque forms seemed to emerge from every corner, their twisted anatomies defying all logic and reason. Maws agape, claws curved for slice, they charged headlong into the fray, only to be met by the Night Terror's ferocious onslaught. Its claws raked across their armored hides, drawing forth gouts of ichor and eldritch fluids. Fangs gnashed and snapped, seeking purchase in the Night Terror's ever-shifting form, but found only emptiness. The creature was a living terror, a manifestation of primal fury that could not be contained or reasoned with. The stalwart monster executed its kill so accurately that no one was left alive after it passed them. Northern didn't even need to deal with worrying about it looking back to see if he was also busy fighting. Either the stalwart monster did not care to begin with and was already deeply consumed by the madness that sought only bloodshed, or it had already trusted him all too well. Northern doubted it could have been the later. Believing Night Terror trusted him was the reason could have worked if he hadn't taken witness to how it grinned at the gate. Now, before Northern's eyes, it was just like an incarnate of chaos and destruction. Its trails were filled with dark red blood, marred by lifeless bodies of horrors with terrific expression frozen on their face as they fell to the doom of this malevolent creature. And this was the monster he was to fight? In that moment, fear gripped Northern, clawing upon his entire body. And faced with the terror of fear, one this immense, every creature were often left with two options. Flight? Forget Nemesis. Forget they are meant to cross path. Forget closing the rift. He was going to die. I can just run away and find a life for me in the rift. That's right, if he could run away now when Night Terror is fighting, he would be able to survive undoubtedly. There was even a rift somewhere in this one. He would enter it, and who knows, it really might be the way outside. Maybe it is. Maybe I should try it again, Northern thought. But then it suddenly dawned on him again. North, you are doing it again. You are beginning to act below expectations. It was like someone rang the words to him, and that brought him back to reality. Fight. He clenched his fist and slowly curled a corner of his lips, shooting his head backward. His eyes gleamed with maliciousness, drowsed in ethereal blue. Whoever you are, you'd have to do better than that to make me give up. In that split moment, Northern's eyes had undoubtedly perceived something. The source of the madness. It was here, in this rift, and was definitely trying to make him turn. It was quite evident why it was doing that. Give or take, Northern was set to destroy this castle and close down the rift. Someone, somewhere did not want that to happen. Chapter 90. Champions of Carnage. Northern narrowed his eyes and clenched his fist. What was that just now? I definitely felt a gaze on me. His eyes rolled left and right, dividing through the destruction to see if there was a suspicious creature. But he saw nothing. After a couple of seconds, he exhaled. Maybe I was just imagining it? No, it was very vivid. That wasn't just an imagination. Someone was watching me, and it seemed like the person was advocating for him to leave. Northern looked at Night Terror as his form weaved time between monsters bathing in their blood and wrenching chaos. Whatever Night Terror has that makes him so strong, I have it too. Both of them swallowed the vestige of the Chaos Prince. Both of them had grown exponentially. More so, Night Terror did not have his visual prowess. Northern opened his hands, a steely determination etched across his features. Perhaps it is time to join this battle, he muttered, as black sparks crackled to life, weaving intricate patterns in the air before him. As the onyx sword materialized, Northern gripped the hilt tightly, swinging the blade down in a graceful arc. In an instant, he flashed onto the battlefield like a loosed arrow, propelled by an invisible force. Northern moved with blinding speed, his blade a blur of obsidian and his eyes emitting azure line of light as he carved a path through the horde. His obsidian blade carved into the bodies of monsters but did never finish what it started. Northern skillfully flew across monsters and destroyed their patterns, leaving them to scramble on the ground. Each monster fell, but the flames of their souls were not extinguished. instead left at mercy by the viciousness of his blade. Northern was intentionally leaving them alive. So long he didn't get the last kill, he won't get talent fragments. That way he can delay whatever was to happen if he gets to 1,000 talent fragments. Despite holding back on killing, Northern exhibited a splendid show of combat style. With each swing of his obsidian blade, he wove intricate patterns in the air, channeling his precision and finesse through his body movements, from minute pivoting of his legs to shooting forward like a bullet. Amazed at how he grasped the complete understanding and function of his own body. It was like he could unnatural feel every fiber of his muscles. He was totally aware of every nerves, every happening within him. And what happens if I push that awareness outside? Northern sought to experiment further even as he left deep gashes in monsters, deliberately avoiding their vitals. Indeed, the clear-cut cognizance he had of his body had to do more with his visual prowess than with his perfect body. Perfect body just provided his ocular powers the sturdy foundation to work to their maximum potential, perhaps even surpass it. But his ability to be so aware of every inch of detail in his body, he suspected to be because of his eyes. If it was possible to be able to feel and tell every detail and movement within his body because his eyes was a part of it, then it should be a walk in the park taking note of his surrounding. Of course, All Eyes plenty much could do that already. Northern could perceive his surround at unparalleled detailed. But it happened one after the other. What Northern was looking at was being aware of his entire space without having to look. Was it even possible to attain such a position? All Eyes had shown a magnificent potential. Northern couldn't help but wonder, just how powerful can I become with these eyes? Night Terror moved with a grace belying its size, weaving through the chaos with a fluidity that defied comprehension. Entire bodies were cleaved apart with a single sweeping strike, their severed appendages raining down upon the combatants like a grotesque shower. Skulls were crushed, bodies rent asunder, and yet Night Terror remained untouched, a whirling dervish of annihilation. The castle's defenses crumbled as the Night Terror pressed its advantage, smashing through barricades and fortifications with ease. Walls crumbled, towers toppled, and the once formidable citadel became little more than a ruined shell, a monument to the Night Terror's unstoppable might. The cacophony of battle, the ceaseless roars and screeches of the combatants, overwhelmed the atmosphere. The stench of death hung thick in the air, a miasma of decay that clung to both warriors' very being. Yet, through it all, Night Terror remained undaunted, indifferent to the massacre, a whirling vortex of destruction that consumed all in its path. Its form shifted and distorted, morphing into ever more horrific and nightmarish shapes, each more terrifying than the last. The horde's numbers dwindled, their ranks thinned by the Night Terror's ruthless inundation. Those that remained fought with a desperate fury, driven by a primal instinct for survival that overrode all reason and logic. Or was it just the madness? But it was not enough. Night Terror was an unstoppable force, a harbinger of annihilation that could not be halted or contained. It moved with a singular purpose, its soul aimed the utter eradication of all that stood before it. Northern danced amidst the fray, his movements fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to the chaotic strut wrought by Night Terror. His blade sang through the air, each strike precise and lethal, driven by a focus and determination that stemmed from a careful observation and analysis of his foe's movement. His attempt to evoke an overwhelming awareness of his surrounding made him falter here and there during the fight, but it wasn't as much to even leave a cut on his pale skin. More so, his battle with Night Terror had proved to be effective. Now that I think about it, my body sort of got accustomed to fighting Night Terror. Could that have been because of Formless? Would that also explain the reason why his clone movements are being seared into his muscles? No, that can't be it. I'd have to give that one more thought after now, gotta focus. With a burst of azure light, Northern propelled himself forward, his obsidian blade leaving afterimages in its wake. He moved with blinding speed, closing the distance between himself and the nearest cluster of monstrosities in the blink of an eye. The first creature, a hulking figure, with razor-sharp talons, swiped at him with a feral growl. But Northern was already several steps ahead. His blade a blur. A general? He gasped as the monster deflected the strike with a resounding clang. Northern pivoted on his heel, the onyx blade trailing black line as it carved through the creature's torso with surgical precision. I avoided your vitals. A spark of recognition belatedly ignited in the monster's eyes as it fell. Perhaps the pain relieved it from the madness that had also consumed it. Immediately, two more monstrosities converged on him, their gnashing maws agape and slavering with unholy hunger. Northern didn't flinch, his movements fluid and graceful as he parried their frenzied attacks. Each strike was met with a precise counter, his blade turning to streaks of black lines. With a flick of his wrist, Northern disarmed one of the creatures, its severed limb clattering to the ground in a spray of ichor. Before the critter could even register its loss, Northern's blade lashed out, cleaving through its skull in a single, decisive stroke. Crap! That was a mistake. You have killed a... The second monstrosity pressed its assault, undeterred by the fate of its brethren. Northern met its charge head-on, his blade weaving an intricate dance of death as he parried and countered with lightning-fast precision. The creature's strikes grew increasingly erratic, its movements fueled by mindless fury. But Northern remained calm and focused, his eyes tracking every twitch and shift of muscle, anticipating each attack before it even began. With a deft twist of his blade, Northern caught the creature's claws mid-swipe, the razor-sharp talons screeching against the onyx steel. In a single, fluid motion, he redirected the creature's momentum, using its own force against it as he pivoted and drove his blade deep into its chest. Ah, again, he muttered. The monstrosity let out a gurgling screech, its body spasming violently as Northern wrenched his blade free, a torrent of ichor gushing from the gaping wound. The creature crumpled to the ground, joining the growing pile of fallen monstrosities that littered the battlefield. No matter how careful he was, it was hard to fight and not kill. But he still had to try regardless. Northern looked around. Compared to when they just entered, the scenery had been contorted into a disgusting land of bloodshed and marred bodies. Of course, more than half of this was wrought by night terror. The monsters had grown very few, and in a couple of minutes, the last remaining few were bound to meet the end of their lives too. But something bothered Northern. As if to confirm his suspicion, a deafening silence suddenly fell on the area. Even Night Terror, with his hand suspended in between the belly of one monstrosity, paused and looked towards the main entrance of the castle. Northern gritted his teeth. Something is coming. He braced himself and clenched his hand tightly around the hilt of his sword. With a tremoring push, the door of the entrance exploded, and a furred beast pompously stomped out of the castle, eyes burning with predatory viciousness. Its once pristine white fur was now dirted by dried blood, a grim testament to the madness of war that had consumed it. Despite the filth that marred its appearance, the beast exuded an aura of undeniable power, its every movement dripping with menace. As it surveyed the area with a menacing gaze, the air crackled with tension. Night Terror stared at the beast indifferently and threw it face to Northern. At its first appearance, Northern had almost trembled in fear. But a second later, his eyes widened and he uttered before knowing. Mr. Fluffy? Chapter 91. Northern vs. Mr. Fluffy Part 1. The culture of the Kingdom of Redmine was based on one law: the strong rules. Since they were vessels of war, constantly seeking bloodshed and carnage, they tend to respect and obey power. Just like how Northern proved himself battle after battle to be the champion, any other monster could, and they would accept it as the champion with no questions asked. Northern, of course, already assumed this was what would happen. He just never expected that it would be Mr. Fluffy. How long had they been gone for the little cute monster to have changed so much? It was now large, standing almost as tall as Wraith. Its eyes were hollow, and gleamed with a madness. In it no other intent existed but to wreak havoc and tear flesh apart. Northern could see that no matter what he did, Mr. Fluffy was not going to recognize him. So, he stepped forward, giving Night Terror a glance before saying, "Don't even think about fighting him. Mr. Fluffy is mine to deal with." I'll knock some sense into him myself. Allowing Night Terror to take care of the beast would be a huge mistake. This vicious monster knew no respite. Night Terror, with his face and dark hide smeared with blood, shrugged and turned away, chasing after other prey. Soon, he disappeared from the front yard and hardly made his way to the backyard. Northern and his pet monster stood opposite each other, the atmosphere wafting with silent tension as both prepared each other for the inevitable. Mr. Fluffy crawled forward, its snarling jaws dripping with saliva as it fixed its blue eyes on Northern. It paused after closing the distance by some steps and with a low growl, crouched low to the ground, ready to pounce. Northern tensed, his grip tightening on the hilt of his obsidian sword. He could feel the primal energy radiating from the beast, a fierce determination burning in its gaze. A smile curled on his face. "You have grown, Fluffy. I don't even know if I can call you Fluffy again. Fluffy, you have been a bad boy, and Daddy's gonna teach you some manners." Northern's eyes glinted menacingly. Sensing the bloodthirstiness that emanated from its opponent, the monstrous wolf lunged forward, its massive form hurtling towards Northern with swift velocity. With a swift sidestep, Northern evaded the attack, narrowly avoiding the sharp claws that slashed through the air. As the wolf skidded to a halt, it spun around, its jaws snapping hungrily as it sought to sink its teeth into Northern's flesh. "That's good. Keep that look in your face. I'll smack it right out," Northern commented, his eyes radiating with glee. With a deft motion, he parried the wolf's attack, the clash of metal against Fong ringing out through the night. Both of them exchanged several ringing clash that sent Northern's hand reeling backward from the recoil. Fuck! It definitely had gotten stronger. In such a short time, Mr. Fluffy had grown exponentially also. Perhaps this was from eating several monster core and growing accustomed to the atmosphere of war. "It must have been so lonely after I left." Northern felt pity for the beast. Perhaps it too was suffering, trapped in some darkness, and this was his fault. Not that he forgot about Mr. Fluffy when they were about to leave. He just couldn't spare the time to care. "I'm sorry. I will relieve you from your sufferings," he said, with a grin on his face, then shot forward, clashing powerfully with the beast. Northern's plan was simple, to inflict so much pain in Mr. Fluffy that he'd come right out of that darkness that clogged his mind. The thought of it made him grin so evilly. Perhaps because he doubted not the fact that he could handle Mr. Fluffy with ease despite the monster growing so powerful. It was not a bluff. It was an accurate and precise calculation brought about by his eyes. Northern even now was not giving his all in the fight. He was playing with the beast to see what it was capable of. That, however, did not mean he didn't get to feel the tearing pain inflicted on him as he made mistakes and let some of Mr. Fluffy's attacks swing past his defenses, leaving shallow cuts over him. He continued to run around the monster, making it swing its quickest attack, gnarl and shoot at him at its fastest pace. But surprisingly, everything was within Northern's prediction. Is it because it's a monster? It's so simple. As the two continued to clash with each other, Northern became more frightening. His growth in barely 5 minutes that they started was awestrucking. No attack slipped. He was now parrying Mr. Fluffy's attacks with one hand behind his back. His legs showed no hasty step, and on his face was etched a cold, villainous smile. With a deafening block, Northern and Mr. Fluffy flew away from each other, while Northern rolled through the air and landed magnificently on his feet. The beast tumbled and managed to use the momentum to stand, albeit magnificently too. Northern looked at the obsidian steel and shifted his gaze to Mr. Fluffy. With a cold smile, he said, "Time to end this." Suddenly a mask of grim darkness contorted his face such that the beast instinctively jumped backward. Mr. Fluffy let out a ferocious roar, as if it was trying to rid itself of the fear emanated from this human. Then it lunged again, its movements fluid and unpredictable. Northern just stood motionlessly as the monster approached him. With a swift counterstrike, he aimed for the beast's flank, his blade slicing through fur and flesh with deadly precision. The wolf howled in pain, its blood staining the ground as it staggered back, wounded but not defeated. With a fierce snarl, the monster launched another assault, its fury undiminished by the pain of its wound. Northern braced himself, his blade at the ready as the beast closed the distance in a blur of motion. The wolf's jaws snapped open, jagged fangs glistening with saliva as it aimed for Northern's throat. And in a split second, Northern pivoted, his obsidian blade deflecting the attack with a resounding clang. The force of the impact sent tremors through his arms, but he remained steadfast, his feet firmly planted on the ground. Without missing a beat, Northern countered, his blade slicing through the air in a graceful arc. The wolf twisted its body, narrowly evading the strike, but not before Northern's blade carved a deep gash along its flank, drawing forth a fresh gout of crimson. The beast howled in pain and rage, its eyes burning with an unholy fury. It regrouped, circling Northern warily, its muscles coiled like taut springs, ready to strike at the slightest opportunity. Northern sighed helplessly. Seriously, that much is not enough to bring you back to your senses? He didn't know how much more he'd be able to control himself from not killing the monster. It was not like he had mastered the art of battle somewhere. If there's anything this battle has been teaching him, it's the fact that for someone like him who had learned to fight through a kill or be killed situation, killing was almost as easy as breathing. He knew where to aim to permanently end the fight, and that was cultivated both from his clones and all those times he spent succumbing to the madness of war. If he wanted to not kill, he just had to not strike those places he usually aims for. But it was like trying to stop a reflex action. It was possible, but only after several failed trials. And he didn't want Mr. Fluffy to be one of those failed trials. If he's not careful, he really might kill this beast. Chapter 92. Northern vs. Mr. Fluffy Part 2. Northern felt awful towards himself. I'm thinking about killing my companion. Yet there's no emotion. He touched his chest. He didn't particularly feel attached to the beast all this while, however, it was really nice having it around. That alone should have warranted some sympathy from him. Northern shook his head. It's just a monster. With a sudden burst of speed, the beast darted forward, its claws raking through the air as it aimed for Northern's midsection. Northern responded with a deft sidestep, his blade deflecting the attack with a resounding clang. Before the beast could recover, he struck back, his obsidian blade cutting the air with lethal precision. The beast twisted and contorted, its body displaying an almost supernatural agility as it evaded Northern's strikes. But Northern was relentless, his blade weaving a deadly dance of steel, each strike calculated and purposeful. The two combatants danced across the battlefield for a few seconds, their movements a blur of motion and fury. Northern's blade sang through the air, deflecting Mr. Fluffy's savage attacks while delivering punishing counters that left gashes and wounds in their wake. Yet, despite the mounting injuries, the madness that burned in Mr. Fluffy's eyes did not seem to be receding, and it caused a tense strain in Northern's expression. He was trapped in between holding back himself from killing the beast or just killing it and forgetting the blessed memories they shared together. I'm human, goddammit. Even though Northern was struggling with what emotions to feel while he thought about killing his companion, he still knew what best to do. The things that made humans humans and not devils. Compassion. It didn't matter if Mr. Fluffy was just a monster. What mattered was they shared a bond together. And that reason was enough for Northern to not want to give up on his buddy. He gritted his teeth as he blocked the beast's strikes again. It was stressful, but it felt right. He couldn't tell what this emptiness, Northern suddenly realized, making his eyes squint. Emptiness, void. A small laugh escaped his lips. Of course, what did I expect after feeling my soul with void? Northern did not know what changes was happening to him, but he knew they were gradually coming. Perhaps what made Night Terror grin like at the gate was not madness, but emptiness. The faster on the terror than it was on him, no doubt. The beast relentless lunged at Northern even though he was lost in thought. Its jaws snapped and gnashed, seeking to render Northern's flesh, while its claws raked through the air, leaving trails of crimson. As the battle went on, the effect of those wounds eventually began to take a toll on Mr. Fluffy's body. Its movement slowed and strikes became less powerful. and Northern could feel it. Even he himself, who had been preserving his stamina for when he would face Night Terror, was beginning to feel the toll on his muscles. It was inevitable, not with the amount of gaping wounds that marred the creature's flesh. Northern lowered his sword with a bitter taste slapping his tongue. Then he called out softly, "Mr. Fluffy?" The beast ferociously gnarled at him. Its eyes were fearsomely rebuking whatever effect Northern's voice was having on it. Seeing the beast struggle to break out of the darkness of that clogged its mind, Northern dismissed and slowly extended one hand. "Mr. Fluffy, it's me." North, his voice came out peacefully, causing droplets of tranquility to fall into the monster's soul. Its pupils slowly distended and a low growl crept out of its mouth. Slowly, Mr. Fluffy went down and lowered its head. Northern's hand finally touched it. When it did, Northern's heart almost jumped out of the beast. "Ah, I'm glad I didn't have to use it." Something shattered into sparks of light behind his back. Despite taking the initiative to calm the beast using the bond that they both have formed over a short time, Northern still had his skepticism and had materialized a black stiletto behind his back in case things went south. Now that he had gotten Mr. Fluffy back, the next foe, Northern's eyes suddenly trembled. Then a big laugh burst out of his mouth. His shoulders shuddered as he laughed even wider for a couple more seconds. Anyone would think he was mad. Then he came to an abrupt stop and frowned towards the castle entrance. "No way I'm going to enter that place. It's a horde of night terrors inside that place." Of course, the problem was not that he was scared of getting killed. Northern at this point was confident in his capability to kill those night terror. When they kidnapped him, he would have defeated one or two, not to speak of now that he was stronger. But that would task his body too much, however he could send his clone. Northern stared at the entrance as he considered the idea. If I command it to not kill, it should be able to not kill, right? He folded his arms and tapped a finger against his hand. Then he decided. No, Night Terror can deal with them all on his own. Even with Night Terror's power and mine, I'm not confident that we'll be able to take down a Maelstrom rank monster. More so, we don't even know the danger level, Northern mused. Besides, I might run out of essence. Things were pretty different now that all the enormous soul energy he absorbed from the measuring crystal had been absorbed by void essence. He could faintly feel and tell the amount of essence he had circulating his soul. Using his clone used to run on soul energy, and then he had an immense amount of it due to the incident at the Citadel. But void essence had done away with all of that. The soul energy in his body did get converted to void essence, but it wasn't half as much as what used to be there. Northern could tell he wasn't so bolstered on void essence, and that might be costly for him should he act irrationally. Even though he decided against helping Night Terror, Northern was sure the monster was more than enough to take care of some half-asset experiments bred from it. That bastard is probably killing his kins with joy. Northern surveyed around. It's a lot of kill, and I didn't even gain much from it. Since he killed two little numbers, he didn't as much receive an item. But it was good, this was his plan all along. He doubted if items received from these mobs was going to be worth much, even though they were Hellion ranks. The Lord of the Castle, on the other hand. I must have the last kill on it. That one was bound to give him lots of reward. And killing Night Terror too. When he added the two, he was definitely going to get compensated largely for his sufferings in this rift. Somewhere in Northern's heart he was so excited. Chapter 93. The Castle Lord, Part 1. Northern stood silently for a couple of minutes. He looked at Mr. Fluffy, who was unconscious. He could hear squelching noises mixed with guttural growls. Night Terror is definitely not taking it easy, Northern mumbled, and leaned against the wall of the entrance. The bastard will probably fight his way to the Lord's room. Then he would join in that moment. In essence, all Northern was waiting for was for the noise to quiet down. Considering the rate at which cries are filling the air, he'd probably be done soon. Northern combed his hair backward with his finger and blew air with his hand. He looked around again. The once neat and grotesquely glamorous castle was now a land of damnation. Northern looked towards the mountain. They are probably some Hellion monsters that are overseeing the activity of the mining in the mountain. But they are not enough to change this situation. Northern closed his eyes and opened them. Then he leaned away from the wall and laid his eyes on the inside. The noise has gone down. Time to go in, I guess. The next battle he would fight would be with the lord of the castle. Thump, 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 thump. His heartbeat ran faster as he dwelled on the thought. I will be fighting a maelstrom rank monster. He stood in front of the entrance, about to enter as the reality sank deep within him. As he moved his legs to enter, Northern sprang back all of a sudden. His dominant hand posed for a sword attack. A sword was already materializing itself into it. His brows creased and he twirled the black sword, slashing down in a graceful arc. It's gone. But I could feel it vividly this time. Northern raised his head to look at the castle. The same pair of eyes that seemed to be looking at him earlier on, focused on him again. And he was sure he could tell because of his own eyes. And this time the location was more vivid. Northern's frown became starkly dark. The lord of the castle. There's more to him. Either ways, he had to end this today. After doing a breathing exercise, Northern steadied his heartbeat and breathing then proceeded into the castle. As expected, the grounds were littered by piles of night terrors. Northern stabbed his sword through one's chest, turned his sword with a squelching sound to make the open wider. Then he used his sword to navigate where the core should be. Northern raised a brow. Of course, there's no soul core, and night terror did not take it out and absorb it. Northern himself just dug through the monster's flesh, and where is the time to do such thing on the battlefield? I suspected that there would be no soul core since they were experiments and not real monsters. But what I don't know is if I would have gained talent fragments had I fought them. Northern breathed. It doesn't matter either ways. I prefer being careful and cautious than being sorry. There's no reason for me to fight them. There's no gain. They will only wear down my stamina. Yes, I made the right choice. He continued, navigating his way through the piles of corpses. Even though he tried his best not to step on them, sometimes it was just unavoidable. Even to the stairs and upper floor. Northern felt his irritation form in his mouth, and spitting his saliva would even made it all worse. He just swallowed and went forward without thinking too much. At least, he was glad that seeing so many corpses had an effect on him. That showed the having void in his soul wasn't that drastic. It wasn't all that bad after all, he thought to himself, and stopped in front of the massive double door. The door was slightly opened, which showed that night terror had already gone. That bastard! Northern seethed but calmed himself and paid attention to listen to whatever was happening inside. There's no sound of blade. No sound at all. Which was rather disturbing because Northern thought the moment night terror entered the throne room, it would rain escapades of attack on the monster. But there was nothing at all. Something is wrong. Northern frowned and summoned his clone. An exact copy of himself materialized beside him, wearing a black armor. His eyes glinted with blue light, but compared to what was in the original Northern's eyes, his were pretty dull. Northern faced his clone and commanded in whispers. Hey, there is only one command I have for you. Use all you have learnt so far to fight the strongest monster inside that room. And whatever you do, don't die. His reason was simple. He'd not have the time to pass information or focus on the link. So it was better to pass the information now from the beginning. It wasn't like the clone was capable of dying permanently. But Northern was worried of something such as his muscles getting sore from sudden pain of memories being burnt into it. Now go! He commanded and slowly stepped back, entering the embrace of the darkness that clung to the corners. The second Northern slowly materialized a silver sword as it walked forward, brimming with determination and purpose. As he stepped into the foreboding room, he laid his eyes on a bipedal monster struggling to stand straight before the eyes of a being clothed in darkness. The castle lord turned its head with deliberate slowness, a wry smile creeping across its pallid face. You! Northern's eyes suddenly widened. Did I just hear well? A monster spoke? Due to attribute vestige of chaos, you can understand the language of monsters. Northern's mouth fell agape, his astonishment evident. Damn, monsters can actually talk? And I can understand what their speech. Did my life just get more complicated? He grimaced ruefully in the darkness. Somewhere deep down, I feel like it just did. Welcome. I have been expecting you. The voice of the castle lord resonated like a convergence of several deep voices. The very air seemed to quiver with its utterances. Northern's clone remained stoic, silent, his expression devoid of emotion. Slowly, he turned his head to fix his gaze upon Night Terror, who struggled to maintain eye contact with the castle lord. Then, with a dark contortion of his features, he drew his sword and lunged. Chapter 94. The Castle Lord Part 2. With a burst of speed, Northern launched himself forward, his sword trailing a blazing arc of light as he unleashed a ruthless flurry of strikes. His blade sang through the air, each slash punctuated by the crackling of energy as it clashed against an unseen barrier erected by the castle lord. The towering being, shrouded in a mantle of swirling darkness, regarded Northern with an intense, menacing gaze, then grinned and uttered in monster tongue. How futile! Its fiery eyes burned with an ancient fury, and the very air seemed to crackle with raw power as it extended its clawed hand, unleashing a torrent of red macabre energy. Northern deftly maneuvered through the bombardment, his sword weaving a deliberate dance as he deflected and parried the barrage of arcane blasts. Embers and smoke swirled around him, the heat searing his skin. Not that he could feel it, as he pressed his assault, determined to break through the maelstrom's defenses. The moment Northern lunged at the castle lord, Night Terror's eyes widened. It was as if the insignificant human had shown outstanding courage. Faced with a stronger monstrosity, it was inevitable. Northern had considered that Night Terror might not be able to even raise its head to look the castle lord in the eye, which was where he came in. He didn't know what it was about Night Terror, but the monster was different. It was a deviant, and maybe he himself was a part of the reason why Night Terror turned out so. It wasn't a surprise that there would be one or two monsters that defied the norms of what a monster should be. Just like his death angel that died protecting him. A very risky move he decided to take if that should happen, and that move was attacking first. However, since Northern did not know if attacking first would guarantee Night Terror being freed from whatever horror would consume him the moment he stood in front of the castle lord, he decided to send his clone. Should things go south, he would just make a run for his life and live to fight another day. Deep down he hoped that Night Terror would not cower. But his hope was useless. His fears were made bare to his face. However, he was right to have depended on Night Terror's defiant nature. Because the moment his clone lunged, Night Terror's eyes gleamed with a primal fury, overwhelming the horror that was slowly making him bow. The monster suddenly disappeared in that instant while Northern, clone, attacked the castle lord. As if waiting for the opportunity to arise, the castle lord reciprocated the attack, and as Northern's sword relentlessly weaved through the energy blast. From the shadows, Night Terror emerged, a hulking mass of muscle and scale. With a thunderous roar, the beast joined the fray, its massive claws raking through the air, leaving trails of scorched earth. The castle lord turned its attention to the new threat, a frown drawing thin on its black face as its cloak billowed and unleashed a vortex of darkness. Tendrils of shadow lashed out like whips, seeking to ensnare and constrict its foes. Northern's clone seized the opportunity, his blade transforming blur of motion as he charged forward, weaving through the chaos. His sword found its mark, slicing through the castle lord's ethereal form, yet the maelstrom made no sound. Instead, the being recoiled, its red aura flickering as it summoned a vortex of energy, casting Northern back with a devastating blast. Night Terror, undeterred, pressed its advantage, sinking its fangs into the castle lord's shadowy flesh, rending and tearing with primal ferocity. The same thing happened, and Night Terror struck into the wall, leaving the wall fractured as it slumped to the ground. The darkness that surrounded the maelstrom monster began to recede, as though they were being called backward. Its form began to solidify and get clearer. Northern, from the darkness he stayed hidden, narrowed his eyes. The attacks didn't go through? It seems as though both of them attacks just now were just against a skin of darkness. The cloak of darkness that overlaid the Maelstrom's body was actually a mantle of protection. If that's the case, why is it being removed? At least that was what this looked like to Northern, who was observing through the eyes of his clone. When the darkness had merged with the monster's body completely, a muscular, humanoid silhouette with elongated limbs and sharp, claw-like hands was revealed. Its skin was pitch black and adorned with red complicated patterns and symbols that evoked a sense of archaism. It was as if the monster itself was a fusion between a human and a beast. It looked nothing like the monsters it ruled. The most striking feature was its head, which takes on a demonic appearance. A pair of fiery, glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, exuding an intense, menacing gaze that seems to bore into their soul. Horns protrude from the being's head, adding to its fearsome and otherworldly visage. The monster's thunderous voice rolled out. "This is rather infuriating. Thinking you can fight me with a fake is extremely ignorant of you." Now that the darkness was now shrouding most of its body, except a baggy tunic that donned its lower body, the castle lord spoke with hand gestures, menace evident in its intimidating gaze. It turned its eyes to Night Terror, who was just standing. The bones of its neck cracked as its head turned left and right. "You dare defy me, Khal, a chosen follower of the Blood Tyrant?" he bellowed, his voice laced with a mixture of contempt and incredulity. Night Terror stood its ground, muscles coiled and ready to strike, undaunted by the castle lord's imposing presence. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within the Terror's chest, a primal challenge that resonated through the chamber. Northern found the monster's defiance to be more amazing. Night Terror was exceeding his expectations of what a defiant should be. Even from where he was hiding, he could feel his heart tremble. "Insolent whelp," Khal snarled, his clawed hands clenching into fists. "You have been granted power beyond your wildest dreams, and yet you squander it by aligning yourself with this insignificant human." Northern's clone remained silent, his gaze steady and unwavering, even as the castle lord's scathing words washed over him like a torrent of venom. "No matter," Khal sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "I shall rectify your foolishness and remind you of the true nature of your existence." With a sudden burst of speed that belied his immense size, Khal charged forward, his clawed hands aglow with a sickly crimson energy. Northern's clone braced himself, his blade poised to deflect the incoming assault. Chapter 95. The Castle Lord, Part 3. The impact was deafening. A thunderous clash of steel and enigmatic might that sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber. Even though Northern's clone had stood his ground powerfully, he flew away like a ragdoll, crashing into the wall and almost shattering it. Night Terror instantly rushed forward, its massive form becoming a black blur of motion as it unleashed a torrent of black flames and claws upon the castle lord. Khal twisted and contorted, his demonic visage twisting into a rictus of fury as he fended off the dual assault. Despite crashing into the wall, Northern's clone quickly regained his footing. Determination etched across his face. He lunged forward, his sword glinting with a cold, silver light. Night Terror also joined the attack, its claws burning with a black flame that looked like live darkness. Nortnern at first wondered what it was, but at a second glance through the clone's eye, he could tell. Void essence. Was that how it's supposed to be, though? It looks too nefarious. The chamber reverberated with their clash, a symphony of violence that echoed through the halls. Stone and debris scattered in their wake as the force of their blows sent shockwaves rippling through the surroundings. Inside the throne room was a whirlwind of steel and claw that threatened to tear the very castle asunder. Northern's clone fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his blade a blur of silver as he fought with the best ability while escaping death every time by the skin of the teeth. Perhaps their enemy would have been bested long ago if it wasn't a maelstrom rank and a being that defied common sense. The fact that the castle lord could talk alone and called itself Khal introduced a variable that Northern never calculated. And now he found himself with one unanswerable question. Even with Night Terror's might, his clone and him Would they be able to defeat this monster? Northern wanted to make sure he answered that question before proceeding to the battlefield. Of course, he felt like a coward for hiding, but he was long past that. The day he decided to prioritize his safety, he became a coward. And if he would be a coward, he was going to be an overpowered one. Yes, an overpowered coward. The clash of steel against claws echoed deafeningly as Northern's clone locked blades with the sinister castle lord. His muscles strained, veins bulging against his pale skin as he mustered every ounce of strength to hold his ground. Sparks flew as Call's razor-sharp claws raked across the silver steel of the clone's sword, the metallic screech piercing the air. While they tangled with each other, Night Terror let loose a bone-chilling roar, plumes of black flames erupting from its gaping maw. The monster's massive form became a blur as it charged, claws wreathed in a nefarious darkness that seemed to leech the very light from the chamber. Call's eyes narrowed, his pallid visage contorting into a vicious scowl as he released a shock-wave of red aura with a sweep of his arm. The red aura slammed into Night Terror like a tidal wave, staggering the monster momentarily. Then Call glared. In that time, Northern's clone swept in, hoisting his sword upward from below in a graceful arc. Call was focused on Night Terror. Even Northern thought it was going to be a sure hit. But all of a sudden, the silver sword stopped mid-air. Without looking, Call had caught the sword within its hand. "What the hell?" Northern from the darkness commented dreadfully, albeit inwardly also. Call still didn't spare the clone a glance. The air surrounding him seemed to disregard the clone and not take him seriously at all. Instead, his eyes were on Night Terror. His monstrous voice filled the room again. "Something is different about you. It's offsetting. You are different, you smell different. I can tell because the blood of my master runs deep in your veins. You too are a creature of Khorne. What have you done to yourself?" Night Terror did not respond. Instead glared maliciously at him as it slowly bent to launch another round of attacks. Call turned his head toward the clone. "Perhaps I should ask the human whom you have brought." Silence ensued for 2 seconds. Then the castle lord looked deep into the eyes of the clone. "You are there, aren't you? You can see me from these spurious eyes." Northern had that moment jerked backwards in the darkness, staggering and almost falling. A monster that could see him through the link of his clone? What kind of horror is this bastard? Something was very wrong about the castle lord. Something was not adding up at all. Perhaps the true defiant was the castle lord and not Night Terror? A million theories ran through Northern's mind in a split second, and all boiled down to one single question. What do I do, run or fight? Northern frowned. He'd been over this before, and he didn't need to visit again. No, this has to end today. Now that the castle lord was aware of his presence and even could see him through the eyes of his clone, it was useless hiding. His element of surprise had been busted. He had to join the fight. "I think my plan to stall and preserve my stamina has been successful so far. Any more would just be me being greedy. Now we have to bring this fight to an end." Northern slowly walked out of the corner and towards the entrance of the room. In a few steps, he was standing in the same scenery with Night Terror, his clone and their foe. "I'm not sure if this will work, but I have a feeling it will." Northern clenched his fist and raised his head. What he intended to do was the highest order of insanity and losing his common sense. A frown contorted on his face as his mouth opened. He hesitated, still not sure if it would work. But he asked anyway, facing Call. "Who are you?" Northern's voice crept out in monster tongue. Chapter 96. Latecomers. Metals clanged with each steps they took. People aligned on both left and right of the city as an array of drifters, shrouded in diverse can of armors reaped from their various kills. The mundane people watched heartily as they made a way towards the end of the capital. Pride could be seen etched across their differential faces, some rugged, some neat, some scarred. Each and every single one of them watched the army of drifters with joy and repletion. After so long, a move was being made to subjugate closest to their settlement, the one that had caused their downfall. The people were filled with nothing but excitement. Their sons and daughters were part of this army, of course, but the major part was populated by the students who arrived a few months ago. A lot had happened, but their arrival culminated things for them in a good way. And now the end was starting. At least that was what the people thought. They watched as the back of the army went further and further away from them till they had disappeared into the horizon. The route the wood pass had been earlier cleared to prevent unnecessary depletion of stamina and strength, and instigate a smooth journey to the rift, which worked perfectly. After a couple of hours, the Legion reached a massive rod of lightning, shimmering and sparking from the ground to the sky. From afar that was what it looked like, but as they got closer, the tear in space became more evident. Even compared to others Gilbert had encountered, this one was more atrocious and different. He stopped in front of the rift and looked up, whispering with a frown etched on his old face. "I have never seen a rift so big." Beside him was the crimson-eyed girl with jet-black hair. She looked at him and looked at the rift. "Will it be tough?" Gilbert turned his head to the young student beside him. "Definitely, Raven." He acknowledged her strength. She was the best amongst her pairs. That was what earned her a place beside him, leading an entire squad of her own. "What next, Headmaster?" Annette deadpanned, making it sound more like a flack than a sincere seeking of the way forward. Gilbert, noting the criticism in her tone, shrugged it off and turned to his right. He lowered his head slightly to the person standing beside the Raven. "If you may, Lady Terence." Even though she was young in her appearance and stature, Gilbert regarded her with sincere respect, and no one looked bothered about it. Not even Annette. Instead, they all maintained a perfect decorum as this Terence lady with white hair and golden eyes stepped forward. She was donned in a body-fitted white suit with golden embroidery running all over its edges and some specific places. Her eyes glowed as she craned her neck to look at the rift. A couple of seconds left and she didn't stop looking. All of them anxiously waited, in perfect silence. Then suddenly she shuddered and almost stumbled to her feet. But the black-haired lady was quick to grab her. "What is it? Did you see something?" Raven asked, urgency ruling her tone. Others did not speak, but clearly their faces were more than enough words. Taking her time, the young lady regained herself from the hands of her savior and closed her eyes, taking a few seconds to breathe. But each passing second only added to the tension. Then she finally turned to the black-haired lady and looked at Gilbert also. "The rift has been occupied. We cannot enter." Gilbert's face crumpled into a grim frown. The rest of the crowd all had confusions drawn upon their faces, straining their expressions in different ways but conveying the same message. Lothellowan, like every other nation around them, were embroidered by several religious culture. They built temples and worshipped gods. Of course, many from other continents also do the same, but more people deem this act as a useless one, because the existence of gods in this world has been proved to be false. But these ones were acceptable by the general population. Why? Because the entity they deify is none other than Ul. All countries in the continent of Starlock gave their soul heart to Ul and worshipped the voice as a goddess. Of course, everyone that were awakened could hear her, but when a temple was erected in her name, an oracle was also selected. From generation to generation, a lady was born with golden eyes and white hair to carry the divination of Ul in her body and connect the heart of the people to their goddess. Terence was the one for this generation. Sadly, she was born in the aftermath of a catastrophe. Although she looked kind or gentle, she had gone through her own fair share of life and possessed an outstanding talent. No one knew of the details, not even Gilbert. He particularly was very careful around this young lady. They all knew she could tell if a rift is viable to enter. She could even go as far as telling how many people were in the rift. Terence had an immense aptitude and connection to soul essence that made her able to sense any and everything. Amazing, yet frightening. "What do you mean the rift has been occupied?" A green-haired bow inquired rudely, his brows furrowing. Terence turned to him wearing a fierce look on her face. "It is as you heard, Mr. Bram. This gate has been occupied by one person. Perhaps there was some of discord amongst them prior to this time." Her voice rose higher than usual. "Terence." As a soft voice called, she turned her eyes to its owner. "Please, can you tell us more?" The black-haired lady inquired gently. That is only because you are asking Raven. Raven nodded with a pretty small smile. The white-haired lady took a few seconds, closing her eyes, then later she opened them. His soul essence is faint. What I can sense is just a little, and it's rapidly disappearing. It's as though his soul is being consumed by darkness or being extinguished. I also can tell that he is at the heart of the rift, currently so close to its core. Silence ensued for a couple of seconds. Then Gilbert broke it. All right then. So we wait and see what happens. If the boy manages to close the rift before he dies, we can storm in and help as fast as we can, and if the boy dies, the rift will open up its gateways and we will take it from where whoever is in it stopped. Gilbert turned to the rest. Let us set camp around the area. We don't know how long it will take, but we are willing to wait however long. With that command, the Legion scattered abroad the expanse, walking in pairs and gisting as they did THR necessary things. Annette stood in front of the rift with her arms folded. Since they started setting up camp until now, almost half an hour later, she was still standing and staring at the rift. Steps gallantly arrived beside from her blind side. Yet she didn't need to look before she knew who it was. Immediately Gilbert stood in front of the gate. She lilted. Do you think the boy could be the one here? Gilbert's brows creased to a frown. There are no certainties, but I doubt that will be possible. Wasn't he a walker? How can a walker survive in this kind of unpredictable rift? Even I would have a hard time. A corner of Annette's lips curled up. I know, right? It's practically impossible, right? And yet, I have this feeling. Chapter 97. The Castle Lord, Part 4. An eerie chuckle crawled out of the maelstrom's mouth. With a flick of his hand, he sent the clone crashing into the wall and faced Northern. Interesting question to ask. Spreading both his arms into the air, he started. I am nothing but a loyal servant and a very strong believer in the hope that lies in bloodshed. Was molded through madness and I thrive in it. He paused, looking into Northern's eyes with a dubious grin. Do you have your answer from that? He chuckled and gestured with his hand. No way. I hear humans are Gomers. Even they happen to be equipped with the best of structures. What you people have, that brain is a treasure out there, you know. His words came out so naturally and was even more frightening since they clearly were not THR language Northern was used to, but he could understand. Amazing well as at that, coupled with the 100 voice in one that it possessed. A dark frown was rimpled on Northern's face as he inquired again. Who do you serve? The Castle Lord went bug-eyed. Such an interesting human. Not only do I find it amazing that you can understand and speak to me, but your interest exalts me. It makes me so happy. Okay. Since you asked politely, I will tell you. Silence reigned in the atmosphere for a while, as Call the Castle Lord fixated his eyes on Northern. Night terror surprisingly was still, since the moment Northern had entered. The 101 voice of the Castle Lord again rolled out, shattering the silence. There are entities in this world that are beyond the knowing of you insignificant beings. I have seen across all dimensions the same thing playing out. You lot are too ignorant and stupid to comprehend the magnificence and scale of greatness. He walked as he continued. You settle for less knowledge, less understanding, less power, less might. It's no wonder why you all are nothing but lesser beings. Northern stayed silent but inwardly was pissed. When will he stop talking down on me and actually tell me? He could not say the words out. The sound of Call's voice already slugged so much fear in his heart. There were currently no balls to be cocky in front of the maelstrom. Perhaps. I shall give you a chance, maybe you will understand my plights. His voice grew somber. He raised his head and turned to Northern, walking closer to him as he started. The blood tyrant, hunter of souls, father of chaos, the origin of courage, honor, strength, hate, and blood. That is what he is. He is the greatest origin to ever exist. The one that found my soul and set me free from the shackles of limitation. He made me see the good that madness can do. All that he said, Northern paid rapt attention, and even though all this thing sounded quite intriguing and grabbed his attention, he still could not understand. So, he figured he'd ask one question. Garnering his balls, he opened his mouth, face to face with the intimidating castle lord. So, he paused abruptly as Call focused on him. His fiery eyes were like they were burning holes into Northern's soul. Northern gulped and parted his lips again, feeling his saliva dry out as he spoke. What I wanted to say is, what exactly is an origin? The castle lord drew a blank face for a couple of seconds, then frowned. He gnarled angrily, erupting a fusillade of red malevolent essence from its form. How dare you mock me? He shouted and lunged at Northern. Before he could make it to half the distance, even though already close to Northern, Night Terror collided with the monster, both of them tumbling sideways and delving cracks on the ground. Northern almost felt he would shit himself just now. It was so sudden and unexpected. What did I do to warrant such reaction? All I did was ask what an origin was. Is it a word I was never to utter? If so, why did he say it to me? Northern was filled with so many confusions. He thought he'd be able to get a few clues as to what the core of the gate is and who the Prince of Chaos was. Call did mention something like the Father of Chaos. But it was not enough for Northern. He just wanted to know more. And sadly, that didn't look like it'd be happening today. Northern's eyes widened and narrowed. What am I even doing? Jacking himself back to reality, Northern spur led into action to seize the opportunity brought about by Night Terror's ambush. The onyx blade materialized into his hands as he shot forward, joining the fray. Before he could land an attack, the castle lord whirled with blinding speed, his claws raking across in a flurry of strikes. Northern had belatedly taken a step backward and shielded himself with his swords. Some strikes escaped him, but only enough to cut shallow wounds. Crap, if not for my training with Night Terror. Northern's muscle senses had been honed from Night Terror inhumane attacks that came with unseeable speed. I have to admit, training with that monster paid off. Night Terror lunged swiftly, letting loose a torrent of black flames that engulfed Call in a whirlpool of void essence. The castle lord emerged unscathed, shrugging off the infernal onslaught as if it were a mere nuisance. I thought you would be different, but I was wrong? You dare mock me? Do you two think I am less of myself because I am chained? He bellowed with an earth-shattering roar. As Night Terror exploded forward on all four limbs, galloping across in a jiffy, Call unleashed a fleet of spectral lances that hurtled toward both Northern and Night Terror. The clone appeared in front of Northern and deflected the deadly projectiles with a flurry of sword strokes, his blade a shimmering vortex of steel, but Night Terror was not so agile. Northern's eyes widened as he saw his monstrous ally. Several lances impaled the beast, black smokes sizzling through its flesh. Night Terror howled in agony, thrashing wildly as it sought to dislodge the torturous barbs. Its massive tail whipped through the air, slamming into Call with the force of a battering ram and sending him careening into the far wall. No doubt, Northern's plan to wear the stalwart monster down had worked perfectly. All those moments of endless movement was beginning to take a toll on it. And now, a bitter taste entered Northern's mouth. Why am I feeling bad? I don't have to feel bad. We will end up fighting each other, so I was only looking out for myself. Northern tried to save himself from the guilt he felt. However, an unasked question bugged the back of his mind. If Night Terror was slowly beginning to get weaker, how were they supposed to defeat this maelstrom? Chapter 98. The Castle Lord Part 5. Northern clenched his sword tightly, not wasting any moment. He lunged forward, his blade aimed squarely at Call's. The Castle Lord recovered with preternatural speed, batting aside the strike with a sweep of his claws. The two combatants traded a flurry of blows, steel ringing against ethereal claws in a deadly dance with Call shouting, "You wretched creatures! Ignorant! Foolish! With your feeble minds and insatiable thirst for dominance." Each of his words resounded with a deafening clang of his claws on Northern's onyx blade. Your arrogance knows no bounds as you trample upon everything, believing yourselves to be the masters of all you survey, but you all are nothing but mere insects scurrying about in the darkness, oblivious to the true principalities that surrounds you. In a frightening roar, he slammed both fists against Northern's sword, causing him to helplessly fly away and tumble like a log. The monstrous entity paused, heaving as he took steady but powerful steps towards the struggling Northern. You cling to your fragile notions of order, but they are but illusions, veils to shield you from the harsh reality of your own insignificance. You wage wars, spill blood, and ravage the very land that sustains you without honor, all in the name of your misguided ideals. And yet, you dare to call yourselves enlightened. Northern's clone appeared next to him, feinted left, then spun with blinding speed, his blade a glimmering arc that narrowly missed Call's neck. The castle lord responded with a vicious counterattack, his claws raining down in a whirlwind of slashes that forced the clone to retreat. Razor-sharp talons scored across the clone's armor, leaving deep gouges in the black steel. Then he continued, first lingering to look at all of them in their different fallen positions. His voice came out with palpable pain and compassion. I, on the other hand, embrace the chaos that you so fear. I revel in the destruction, the discord and the insanity that it brings, for it is through that insanity that true freedom is born. He breathed and laughed. Your feeble attempts to subdue me only serve to amuse me. You cannot comprehend the power that lies within the insanity of chaos. You cannot comprehend the power of the origin of blood. Shut up. Call tilted his head toward the monster that just shouted. Northern was standing, his once snowy white hair almost covering his eyes. He didn't know what this monster was going on about, but the ideology was sick. And strangely something was connecting in his head. Va? Bloodshed? Chaos? You keep spitting nonsense to my ears, it's so annoying. You speak of madness as if it is some divine state. You are just a deranged entity that can't see beyond bloodshed and chaos. He stood straight and frowned at Call. Funny how you attribute honor with wars and bloodshed, as if there is a right way to kill a person. You say that insanity is freedom, but I have experienced it once and it is nothing but slavery, which is why I can tell Call, you are just a soul in bondage. Call was silent for a few seconds, his dark face growing distant, then a fearsome scowl contorted his face. Impertinent mortal! He shot at Northern and both of them clashed once again, hauling frightening strikes at each other. The wounds on Northern's body kept increasing while he was unable to slice through the monster's skin. Even when his blade slipped past its defenses, Call's skin was like stone. Northern jumped back, dodging Call's claws. A disturbing smirk formed on his face as he repositioned his hand on the hilt of his sword. My word stung, didn't it? As it should. You may see yourself as a harbinger of chaos, but you and your master are nothing but pawns of your own twisted desires. What a graceless state to be. Northern ended, casting a gaze of disgust on the castle lord. Suddenly his face became so grim, brows carved deeply into a deep scowl that horrified his entire facial features. The castle lord snarled in fury, his form flickering as he disappeared and appeared in front of Northern. Then he began to rain down ferocious strikes, shouting, "Don't you dare me with such condescending eyes! I am greater than you. Who was it that drove you into madness? Who was it that made you taste freedom? Who? Tell me who it was that ruled you and gave you the ground of war and bloodshed. The strength you wield now, your growth. Tell me, who did you owe it to?" Northern continually blocked, feeling the recoil on his muscles as each strike was vying to rip his hands apart. He was sure that if he was using the silver sword, it would have broken from deflecting the strikes that the castle lord was currently battering him with. He was angry and it made him become more powerful. Crap! I really hit the wrong spot. Northern mused but frowned a second later. To hell with it all! Northern at this point didn't care anymore. He was not an upright human in a way, at least from his own point of view. Nor was he one that held on to some heroic belief, he was just his own person. Even from his past life and now, he had his own belief, some were selfish and some were rational, but all of them were based on his point of view and experiences. Judging from the way Call spoke, it was obvious that it was a creature that relished in destruction and the disturbing satiation it brought. Now, Northern was not sure all that talk about madness, but he earlier began to suspect something playing out. He had to muster the balls to reply, and arrogantly too, because that was the only way to get the information he needed. Now, he was very sure that the day he met the Castle Lord Khal was the day the seed of madness was sowed in his soul. Khal was the one inflicting all the monsters with insanity. Khal is the deranged king that sacrificed his people for power. That would explain why he is too strong, could talk and had these twisted ideologies. Northern slowly breathed, steamy air seeping out of his mouth. He changed his sword from his left hand to his right hand, then looked at Night Terror and his clone. Then his gaze drifted back to the fuming Castle Lord. It's fine. I have all the answers I need. You are the one I need to purge to finally be free of this hell. You are the deranged beast of a person that turned his entire kingdom into an ocean of blood, all for power. Khal raised a brow, puzzled as Northern continued. Don't get me wrong. I don't care about what you did. I am not a hero. I don't protect the values or honors of humanity. Nor do I have an opinion on whether what you did is right or wrong. I just need to leave this hell you have created. Please die and let me go home. Chapter 99. The Castle Lord, Part 6. Northern and his clone lunged at the Castle Lord simultaneously. Northern's onyx blade tracing a crude arc while his clone's silver sword followed the same pattern but in opposite directions. The Castle Lord parried intensely, diverting his hands in all directions as Northern and his clone moved around it. Night Terror joined the fight too, shooting forward with its jaws gaping wide as it sought to engulf Khal in a tidal wave of void flames. Thinking you can overpower me with numbers is nothing but wishful thinking, the Castle Lord snarled. He swung his hands, releasing a pulse of red essence that repelled both the clone and the beast, buying him precious moments to regain his footing. The battle continued, the combatants trading blow for blow in a fever pitch of violence that threatened to tear the very castle asunder. Northern's clone fought with the fury of a cornered animal, his blade leaving behind trails of silver lines as he unleashed a relentless barrage of strikes. Khal deftly parried and countered, his claws a whirlwind of motion that danced perilously close to the clone's flesh. Despite the injuries that spread across its body, Night Terror punctuated the clash with earth-shattering roars, its void flames searing the air and bathing the chamber in an eerie, nefarious glow. The stalwart monster's claws rent deep gouges in the stone with every swing, its sheer size and strength a force to be reckoned with. Northern feinted and struck, his blade a blur of black that sought any chink in the Castle Lord's defenses. Yet, for every blow they landed, Khal seemed to shrug it off, countering with strikes of his own that pushed the three of them to the brink of their limits. The monster paused as he watched them struggle to land a hit on him. All three had retreated and were standing surrounding him. A smirk contorted his pallid face. This I find amusing. What did you say about purging me? He giggled eerily. You will purge me? You insignificant being siding with a vicious and power-drunk king, and with a fake entity. He laughed villainously for a couple of seconds. This is by far the weirdest cohort I have ever encountered in my life. Northern frowned as the monster laughed again. Insignificant being, I guess that's me. Fake entity. That's my clone, vicious and power-drunk king. His eyes slowly shifted to Night Terror, who was standing with a feral composure, about to dive in. Night Terror? Impossible. Before now, all the clue that Northern had gathered to prove that Khal the Castle Lord is the king that filled his kingdom with blood for the sake of power. He was sure. But at the same time, something was not right. The way Khal spoke, the things he said, and what he addresses himself to be, follower of the origin of blood. Northern's instincts felt like Khal just wasn't the one. However, there was no better explanation. I thought I was just overthinking it, but everything changes if Khal is referring to Night Terror as the power-drunk king. Then it would come to make a lot of sense as to why the stalwart creature was so different from the rest, and why it seemed to hate the Castle Lord so much even though it should be a monster subjected to the hierarchy regardless of its defiant nature. Night Terror, of course, could not bow to the hierarchy because Khal was never a part of that hierarchy. If Night Terror really is the mad king that sacrificed his kingdom all for power, then it would mean he is supposed to be the one at the top of the hierarchy. However, Khal's presence changed all that. Who then is Call? And what was he doing here? As more walls of questions were broken through, even more formidable ones seemed to arise. Northern was so confused. Night Terror is the deranged king? He had been living with the cause of his problem all this while. Wait. Let's not rush this and make the same mistake again. I think I should calm down and play with this bastard again. Northern straightened his back and placed his sword over his shoulder, wetting dry expression with a smug grin. The castle lord frowned deeply in response. Seeing such confident grin on Northern's face despite the insignificant human losing fill him with so much rage. Northern knew it would. He needed him to lose his composure after all. You sacrificed your people. Because of your deed, the land became a place of horror and bloodshed. You made them into savage monsters and turned them into instruments driven mad by the hunger for blood. Call, frowning, suddenly interrupted Northern. I will have to stop you right there? What nonsense do you speak? Ah, I'm so lucky this bastard has mouth and can speak. This would have been so hard. Gosh, it's so easy to fool him. Northern retorted with a stern glare. This kingdom, this destruction, the madness that fills this realm. While all this is my deed, it was only asked by the people of this land. I was just on my own when they began to offer so much blood to bring down the greatest quiddity of power. He looked at Night Terror and continued, however, the bloodshed they wrought filled me with so much vigor and gave me the opportunity to break 2 parts of myself free from the shackles. Oh, so the kingdom brought you here? Something like that, Call replied disinterestedly. He's amazingly honest for an advocate of chaos. Call had mentioned that he divided himself into 2, which was baffling, but Northern suddenly connected it to something he saw. That was none other than the fire in the cave that he came across twice. If it was a monster of this level of intelligence, then perhaps Call was indeed telling the truth. He did split himself into 2 thanks to the bloodshed. The bloodshed filled him with power. Does that mean there is more to him than being a monster? Northern was slowly beginning to understand why Call since the beginning has been referring himself to be a follower of the Blood Tyrant, the origin of blood. Whatever this origin was, Northern suspected it was a being with supreme power over blood. But not just blood, also rage, honor, strength, and hate. There was something linking through all of them. Northern, however, couldn't put it together just yet. He wasn't even in a place to do so. Northern breathed and said, raising a corner of his lips, telling me all this information, aren't you worried? Call raised his chin with a vile laughter. Then, as it receded, he replied, worried? Whether I tell you or I do not tell you, it changes nothing. I will do what I plan to do. Northern grinned. And that there was the last piece of the puzzle. Chapter 100. The Last Dance, Part 1. Thanks to Call's willingness to reveal information, Northern now had a few things down right. And one fact stood annoyingly shocking out of it. Night Terror is the king that sacrificed his people. However, that didn't settle things. Inasmuch as it was a valuable information, it was still useless. Rifts had soul cores. Those soul cores oftentimes are the reason for why they exist. Bringing together all the information offered by items, the patterns of monsters and clues gained from careful studying of the environment, an underlying tale is discovered. One that existed before the rift. That was what Northern felt this to be. At the core of this story is always a linchpin, and that linchpin should be his ultimate clue to finding the rift soul core. Northern stared at the castle lord for a couple of seconds, then glided his eyes to Night Terror. One was a king that destroyed his entire kingdom all in the name of power. The other is supposed to be a quiddity of power that was brought about by the sacrifice of thousands of lives. Undoubtedly, he is the guardian of the rift. Killing him should reveal the location of the rift soul core, which I suspect should be somewhere around that throne. From the little he had heard of rift, their soul cores were usually concealed in important spaces and are revealed the moment the guardian is defeated. But there was something bothering, which was why he needed to know. Northern sighed. I'm not dealing with one defiant, but 2? Call had a motive for appearing in this place, It could have been what made the rift so flexible and have something to do with the 3 different kind of monsters that they occasionally battled against. Northern had wondered for a long time where they came from. The rift they had encountered too. It wasn't a gateway, and clearly looked like a rift. So undoubtedly something was fishy. The only problem was that the more he thought about, the more confusing it got. And a heavy ache was beginning to slam his head. Damn it all. I just want to get out of this hell. Would turning a blind eye to all other mysteries be a good idea? Northern knew it probably wouldn't, but he wanted to be selfish. He needed to be selfish. Because, I want to leave this place. Northern closed his eyes, he inhaled deeply and exhaled. Then the black blade in his hands disappeared. Disarming yourself. Have you finally surrendered to your inevitable fate? Call grinned from ear to ear. Even Night Terror looked surprised by his sudden action. But Northern didn't say anything and just stared with a dead expression. Then he looked at his clone and nodded. The battered Northern slowly dissipated and returned. Northern was overwhelmed by pain, running across his muscles. Crap! I can never get used to this, he bit in a groan as he endured the pain without falling. Not even to his knees. He just held himself together and bent over as the pain surged through his muscles. The castle lord observed a puzzled expression. A brow of his was raised even though not much could read from his flaming eyes. Northern straightened his back as the pain went down. Thank God. It's not too much. Fainting would have been very dire in this situation. Northern looked at Night Terror. I'm still bothered as to why Night Terror is not the guardian of the rift. Maybe the rift does judge things based on strength. Call's interference offered power to Night Terror. The power was the madness he filled them with. But he too had his own motive. Northern breathed, spacing his thoughts. Which I have no intention in finding out. He just wanted to go home. Slowly he crossed his hands in front of his face. 2 stilettos weaved themselves out of thin air. But instead of white sparks, they were materialized from black and almost unnoticeable sparks. I guess now that my soul essence has been converted to void essence, every other thing is affected. He couldn't use void essence like Night Terror was using it, but he too had gotten stronger. I was saving this for Night Terror, but I guess I will have to use it. Tis annoying. After fighting with Night Terror on several occasions, and finally watching him easily rip the corpse eaters to shreds. Something finally clicked for Northern. It was just an idea, but it felt right. It felt like the true reason why he had that attribute called Formless. It also had more ties to his main ability, the copycat system. Watching Night Terror fight with the corpse eater, a thought suddenly sparked in Northern's mind. I want to be able to move like that. It was a wishful thinking, but it ignited more series of thoughts, and strangely they felt like he was putting the puzzles right where they should be. How could he move and fight like Night Terror did? He had no claws and had not the kind of speed and strength Night Terror had. Well, he didn't need to have Night Terror's level of speed and strength. But the lack of claws was still a great deficit. But Northern progressive thinking made him realize he didn't need claws. He just needed something that would permit him to move his hands like Night Terror did while acting as a devastating force of attack. And the answer was simple. Daggers. It was also a good one, since he didn't want to stick to one type of weapon. Northern had used the dagger before, although it was quite amateurish, but he couldn't deny that there was literally no difficulty in mastering daggers. Even when he was used to them, he could still easily switch to one-handed sword, and sometimes he wielded the silver sword with 2 hands. Amongst all this transition was an ease of adaptability and flexibility, which he belatedly realized came from the formless attribute. He was water that is basically given shape by the cup. Northern's body and form adapted to fit the form of his weapon. Although before now, it had all been happening without conscious effort and proper understanding. But now that he understood to a degree and had these eyes, things were bound to be different. Although I am still very pissed that I have to use it here, I thought this would have definitely helped me defeat Night Terror. Northern looked at Night Terror and smirked. Shall we give this deranged bastard a last dance?